The Prince of Nowhere. Part 1. The City. In a kingdom not so far from our world lived a young prince. As the youngest of 7 brothers, the burden of the throne did not weigh heavy upon him. It was expected that he would learn the royal customs, receive a proper education from the Magi, and take a wife and an office within the royal household one day. His low standing provided the boy more time to be curious and to indulge his imagination. The young prince would often stand upon his toy chest and gaze out his window with his looking-glass at all the activity of the realm below. He saw the pleasantries of the royal courts, the gleaming armor of the guards, atop the ringed walls which divided the city into 3 circles. And beyond them he saw puffs of steam rising from the bustling markets of the vast outer ring. Tilting his looking-glass up past the walls of the city, he looked out to the furthest reaches of the realm, where stood his favorite sight of all, the ancient watchtower. The tower mystified the young prince and set his imagination on fire. Twisting the ornate metal shaft of the looking-glass, the prince felt the embossed runes pass through his fingers in a familiar pattern as the tower came into perfect focus. Surrounded by glittering sand was a great white rock. The tower, built on this rock, stood tall against a backdrop of mountains. A magnificent gate was hewn into the rock at the base of the tower. The prince marveled at the jewel-encrusted door dazzling in the sunlight. Zooming out, the prince saw 11 crystal pillars, standing like sentries in front of the gate. They rippled light that made the desert floor look like a golden sea before the mountainous white rock. The foundation of the tower was made of 10 bright-colored boulders that covered the whole rock. They fit impossibly tight, with no markings of any tool. Atop them were 25 stones set in the same manner. After these rose 35 more and 40 more stones of diverse hues atop them. Beyond these, the prince lost count. The rocks above were smaller and uniformly fashioned into squares. Some set proud of the wall, wrapping the tower in a spiral staircase to the keep at the top. As the spire grew, the diverse colors of the stones blended into a white so pure and bright it made the boy squint to look at. However, some of the stones set into the tower walls refused to blend in. These stones looked garish and stole from the radiance of the spire. Moreover, these darkened stones were loosely fitted and were about to fall. As the young prince scanned the fallen, now littering the desert floor, he recognized the shards of a 12th crystal pillar shattered by a fallen black rock. The young prince had not seen anyone near the tower, nor heard of anyone who'd been there. Yet on clear nights, when the top of the spire was not deep in the clouds, he could see a flicker of light inside its keep. The ancient watchtower, barely visible to the naked eye, was ignored by the people of the city. No one could say who built it or why it was there. On rare occasions, one might hear rumors of the monolith told like ghost stories around a campfire, but no one seemed to take any serious interest in its history or purpose. His father, the king, spoke of it only once, saying it was abandoned before the time of his father's father, and reminded his son that their kingdom had no threats and no need to station a cohort at an abandoned watchtower far outside the city. He admonished the young prince to forget those things that time had forgotten, and to take a greater interest in his royal studies. His mother also grew tired of his curiosity about the watchtower. She would scold him whenever he brought up the subject and parrot his father's command to take a greater interest in his role as a prince of the realm. The crowned magicians and wise men dismissed his questions about the tower and punished him with added studies about obscure subjects like the ratios for mixing mortar to fix cracks in the outer walls. The young prince learned never to speak of the tower with the wise men. The prince tried to show them the lights in the keep, which he spied with his looking-glass. However, no one else could see them, and most couldn't be bothered to look. His mother was none too pleased to learn of his reputation as a half-wit, deluded by fantasies. and she doubled his royal duties to keep the boy from distraction. Her plan worked. The boy, too busy for childish things, put the looking-glass in his toy chest and remembered it no more. Chapter 2. The Young Prince. The prince grew into a young man immersed in preparations for royal life, and while the tower remained, he paid it little attention. Instead, he trained his thoughts on managing the city's outer rings, even though he'd never been allowed to visit them. It was nearing the time when he must choose a wife from among the maidens of the court. The prince resigned himself to his fate, while his mother busied herself in finding a suitable bride. The young prince seemed aloof, performing his duties with tepid obedience. His lack of enthusiasm for the humdrum of the royal house angered his mother. On the evening of the gala, the prince sat alone in his room, dressed in his finest clothing, awaiting the royal attendants to escort him to the great feast. In a few hours, he and other young royals would join in an elaborate ritual to pair them off for marriage. Feeling melancholy towards the evening's events, he walked over to his windows to cheer himself with the familiar sights and sounds of the realm. Stumbling over the small toy chest and spilling his childhood looking-glass onto the floor. It was much smaller than he remembered, though finely crafted with rich, arcane markings. He picked it up and peered out the window. It was a beautiful summer evening. The air was warm, and the darkening blue sky was clear. A full yellow moon sat large and low on the horizon. Through the looking-glass he saw all the familiar sights of the realm. The royal court's festivities, the guards' gleaming armor, and the puffs of steam rising and disappearing like little clouds from the outer ring. And there, at the edge of night, stood the tower. Gone was his melancholy, consumed by wonder at the black silhouette of the tower in the night sky. He traced its moonlit edges with the looking-glass until he saw the familiar flicker of light coming from its crown. His heart soared as a long-forgotten reverie overtook his senses. Then he heard a knock on the door. The royal party had arrived to fetch him. He dropped the looking-glass into a secret pocket. He tried calming himself, but adventurous thoughts of climbing the tower branded his heart like hot irons. And after tonight, the young prince knew that escaping the city would be nigh impossible. His every waking moment would be in preparation for his upcoming marriage and royal duties. It would be years before he could escape his mother's scrutiny and that of the royal household. The doors opened, and the queen mother, along with her entourage, entered the room. The prince wore a splendid coat of blue and silver, embroidered with tiny diamonds of rare clarity, sapphires of the deepest blue, and a few fiery rubies. His mother, resplendent in her own gown of similar style, ran her hands over the jacket to smooth out the remaining wrinkles. His dress was impeccable, but his face was flush from his trance. This did not escape her notice. She scowled at her youngest son, and her speech was curt about his demeanor. The entourage whisked the young prince down the spiral steps, through the grand hall, and out to the courtyard. The night was young, and the royal garden was ablaze with firelight, which danced off the sequined garments worn by the royals and the nobles present. The musicians were in mid-swing. The smell of roasted meats filled the air, and the wine was flowing. Then, something like a plan began to form in the prince's mind. The gala was one of the only times a year when the royal gates of the city were open to the outer circles. The king invited guests throughout the realm to join the celebration and to witness the coronation ceremony for their new royal couples. Chapter 3. First time in the city. The festivities had been going on all day, and a few guests who'd outpaced their appetites lay slumped against the castle walls. With his mother distracted in polite conversation, the young prince saw his opportunity to escape and ducked into the crowd, grabbing the soiled cloak of an unconscious reveler. Then, assuming the manner of a drunken fool, he stumbled toward the outer gate of the royal courts. A fight broke out in the crowd. Someone shoved the prince face first into a royal guard. He was sure he would be recognized, but the guard pushed him aside and made his way into the crowd to break up the skirmish. The young prince breathed a sigh of relief and slipped past the royal gate and into a circle of the city he had only known through his studies. No one paid him attention as he made his way through the bustling crowds of the second ring, and then through the grimy gates of the lowest and largest circle of the city. His journey had taken many hours, and the sun would not be long in rising. No doubt his mother had noticed his absence shortly after his escape. A party of royal guards would be searching for him by now, and daylight would bring them an increased chance of success. The prince shuddered at the thought of what a foolish thing he'd done, and a mild terror crept up his spine as he realized how alone he was in the lower city's vast, stinking mess. Hot steam rose from open sewers flowing in hewn trenches off the sidewalks. Moisture evaporated from the mossy walls by the flame of crude torches, and the kitchens of street vendors all colluded in the thick, oily mists that filled the air. High in the sky, the moon was now a bone-white dot of putrefying light. Chapter 4. The Bread Man. The young prince, exhausted from wandering the streets and unsure how to escape, collapsed against the moist wall, tears streaming from his eyes. He covered himself with the shabby and stinking cloak he'd stolen, but could not keep out the damp cold. Through his tears, the prince saw a kaleidoscopic vision of a man standing in the middle of the street, dressed in a tattered covering like his own. The man hid his face beneath his hood. A twinkle of moonlight shone from his eyes and bore straight through the prince. People shuffled past the man, but he remained motionless, holding forth what looked like a small rusk of bread. The prince reached for the bread from a primordial hunger deeper than his stomach, and the man was instantly near him. The prince flipped his hands palm open, crossed right over left to receive the bread. The man placed the bread in the hands of the prince, then spoke in an otherworldly voice. "You must not eat this bread until you get where you're going." "You mean the tower," the prince exclaimed, and he cast his eyes upon the top of the spire peeking out far beyond the wall, then dropped his gaze to the rusk in his hands. But the bread man was gone. So he wrapped the bread in his handkerchief and put it into his pocket. He took a few coins from his pocket and used them to buy a meat popkin from a nearby food vendor. He ate the greasy pie in 3 bites, and his belly warmed like a small furnace. He walked towards the great outer gate of the city, hopping over the trickle of foul, greasy water which ran between the stone pavers, occasionally surging with fresh dispatch. The people of this circle lived in small huts caked against the wall like swallows' nests, and in front of them were market stalls for their meager businesses. His heart sank like a stone upon seeing the gate. The doors were thrice his height and made of thick oak and banded in spiky iron. Large chains anchored by heavy gears would open the doors. However, judging by the moss and vines, it seemed the doors had been shut for ages. The prince thought to himself, why would they open the doors? The city had all it needed within its own walls, even if all it needed was the vast poverty surrounding him. The thought occurred to him that maybe the world beyond the gate was terrible, uninhabitable, or filled with monsters with which no one may contend. The prince knew little of the outside world. His teachers never spoke of it, and the rumors were too dull to be remembered or too terrible to be believed. Seeing the gates, however, aroused his curiosity, adding to his resolve. He must see the world beyond these walls, and the tower after that. He had little time and no idea how to escape the city. The gates were closed and heavily guarded. The sun would be up soon, and he knew the royal guard was not far behind. Leaning against the wall, he watched the gates from a short distance away, hoping for an opportunity. None came, and the prince dozed off. Chapter 5. A Crack in the Wall. Something wet and warm bristled against his leg. The prince awoke, biting his hand to hold back a shriek, clearing the sleep from his eyes just in time to see the naked pink tail of the creature scurry off into the dark streets. Tempering his disgust, he watched the large rodent disappear between the stones of the great wall. The guards also noticed and remarked in disgust. The prince considered how easily the rodent had avoided the guards and slipped into the crack in the wall. He snatched a large natty hide along with tan leather whip from a nearby stall and disguised himself as a very, very large rodent. The prince bumbled across the street on all fours, mimicking the cadence of the rodent. He was nearing the wall when he heard a guard crudely remark about the creature's size, jesting to the archers above to make target practice of the beast. The prince was alarmed that his decision could cost not only him his life, but that of the guards once they discovered they had murdered a prince of the royal house. It took everything in him not to speed up, but he knew the guards would take notice and he would blow his cover. He felt an endless moment of silence, wondering if the archer's arrows were taking aim. Finally, a guard called out as he reached the wall, saying to leave the creature alone and that the cleanup would not be worth the kill. From beneath the hide, the prince slid his hands into the large crack in the wet black stone and pulled himself into the tight void. His disguise shrugged from him like molted skin. He wondered how long it would take for the guards to notice the remains. All was total darkness as he shimmied into the wall, an inch at a time. As the crack narrowed, the stones tore off the shabby cloak he had stolen to disguise his royal attire. He could hardly move, and the fetid air was suffocating. The prince was careful to keep his breathing low and slow so as not to panic, while his mind clung to the calculus that if that large rodent could make it through the wall, so could he. As if being stuck in the wall wasn't bad enough, he felt the bristle of fur and the scratch of tiny claws crawling over his legs, shoulders, and face. He was terrified, but did not think it possible to pull himself back. He shimmied forward, but the progress was too slow, and the fear of being stuck, eventually dying in the castle wall, began to drown his hope. The prince mustered the will to put feelings of revulsion behind him by fixing his imagination on the tower, its crown adorned by the starry host. This vision alone drew him forth inch by inch, until the midnight blue of his dream gave way to the midnight blue of the ancient stones hemming him in on all sides. The sharp cool of the air outside began to tickle his nose. Hope revived him as he shifted one arm past his shoulder and began to pull himself forward in an awkward spiral before dropping to his back on the dewy grass outside the city wall. Chapter 6. Outside the Walls. The prince lay there looking up at the starry host from his vision, thanking his stars, for they were the highest thing he knew to thank, and they seemed to twinkle in delight. The prince got to his feet to survey the landscape. To his right was the tower looming further than ever on the horizon, and to his left the sky was bruised a deep purple by the coming sun. His royal clothes had survived much better than he expected. The metallic threads and crystal sequins shimmered in a mirror of starlight. Not one had been torn from his garment. He hugged the wall, knowing that the guards looked out as much as they looked in, and he was now fully exposed. Before him was an open field with no cover. Beyond the field was a forest he could escape into, but there was no way to cross the distance without being seen, and most likely shot by the guards. The sky was pink and orange, and the fires of morning kindled. Daylight would reveal the young prince standing near the wall. He could not hide, and he could not run. The young prince felt peaceful having made it this far. He guessed his journey was at an end as a pale yellow and blue sky filled the eastern horizon. The guards would notice him any second now, and he would have to surrender. The prince considered ways to appease his mother's wrath upon his return, but nothing came to mind. Touched by the light of dawn, a cloudy mist rose from the ground, covering the field like a blanket. The prince smiled at his luck and began crawling on his belly through the low, icy air. He did not know if this would provide the cover he needed, but it was his only chance to cross the field, and it was now or never. He was not even half the way to the forest when the mists began to thin in the morning sun. The prince crawled until he was certain his cover was gone, then stood and ran for the forest. He was sure he heard the whistle of arrows from the archers lining the wall. But the prince ran for his life, not turning to the right or the left. And it is true that had he looked back, the sight would have stopped his heart. The prince ran to the edge of the clearing. Then, tripped by the root of a tree, he fell and tumbled down a steep gully. The prince got up from his fall, dusting himself off. He looked at the towering trees above. A canopy of leaves splintered the morning sun into thousands of tiny diamonds. He assumed the guards had seen him, and he also assumed they were afraid of the world beyond the walls. And he guessed they would be cautious about pursuing him into the forest. A stream flowed nearby, and the thirsty prince drank deeply. The cold water pricked his throat like tiny daggers. While refreshed, this satisfaction also served to remind him that he was starving. Feeling the rusk in his pocket, he wondered if now was the time to eat the bread, but he resisted the urge. He wanted to rest, but couldn't take any chances, so he began to walk, following the stream. He ate berries from the small bushes which grew along the way. They gave him strength, but did nothing to slay his hunger. Chapter 7. The Meadow of Nowhere. The prince followed the bubbling waters under a thick canopy of the forest trees. He tried to sleep at night, but deep in the forest unearthly sounds kept him awake. And when he thought about resting during the day, the eerie silence of the forest haunted him. On the third day, the gully leveled out, the trees thinned, and the stream trickled as the prince entered a vast meadow. The field was full of tall golden grasses, waving in the midday breeze. Wildflowers of red and blue poppies painted the meadow. The dome of the sapphire sky embraced the meadow on every side, and beyond the low, dusty clouds on the horizon was the great and ancient tower, set against a wall of mountains. The young prince reached for his looking glass and scanned the tower. The noon sun and the ambient dust hid the details of the monolith in an impenetrable gray haze. Still, he thought, he glimpsed the glow of light in its keep. The prince, cheered by the sight of the tower and the beauty surrounding him, chuckled. "I'm a prince in the meadow of nowhere." And after a short rest, he set out across the tall grass. End of Part 1. The City. Part 2. The Bloodvines. Chapter 8. The Cohort. The young prince walked through the tall golden grasses towards the edge of the meadow. His hands dipped to touch the sapphire and ruby petals of the poppies blooming around him, their colors peeking in the midday sun. Ahead of him was a clearing where the meadow rolled down into marshlands of emerald pools and blood-brown willows. Steel-gray clouds covered the horizon, hiding the tower from sight. As he surveyed the changing landscape, a glint caught his eye, and he dropped for cover in the tall grass. With his looking glass, he saw a cohort of royal guards traversing the marshes on horseback. It was just as he feared. His mother had sent a search party. The soldiers must have known that he would end up here after leaving the forest, and they were searching for him in the open terrain of the marshlands. He watched as the line of soldiers moved through the marshes, avoiding the pools of eerie green water with trained caution. The rider in front bore a flag with the sigil of the royal house, and at the back was a chain gang of what could only be prisoners. Had others escaped too, the prince wondered? Had these guards been sent to round up everyone who'd escaped? If so, how many more had the same idea to escape as the prince? Glassing the procession, he watched as they made their way toward the thickets and brambles bordering the marshlands. Deep in the brush emerged the source of the darkening sky. A giant pillar of smoke moved through the dense thicket towards the caravan. He glassed the cohort again, zooming in on the deathly pale faces of the royal guards. They were afraid and growing more so as they approached the gnarly blackened brush. He trained his glass on the prisoners. These were no criminals. They were only children. Not one of them looked a day older than himself. Many wore the dress of lesser nobles. Their faces were wide-eyed and sullen, each one transfigured by tears and terror. The young prince watched the procession, dumbfounded by the sight of the child prisoners. The poppies surrounding him lost their luster as the approaching pillar of smoke filled the sky with ash. Crouching, the prince made his way to where the meadow met the thicket. The procession stopped at the edge of the thorny bushes, raised their flag, and blew a somber horn 5 times. Chapter 9. The Hag. The swirling smoke pillar moved to meet the cohort. The prince saw red lightning flash inside the unnatural smoke, revealing the shadow of a hideous creature cloaked within its billow. As the smoke reached the edge of the thorny brambles, a giant hag thrice the height of the flag-bearer stepped out from the lightning cloud. Her pale green skin was stretched to the limit over her bony frame and mottled with blood-brown stains matching that of the willows growing from the emerald pools. Long, thin wisps of hair blended with the smoke, obscuring her face. Hunched as she was, her naked breasts sagged comically low, drenching her potbelly in bloated flesh. The hag pointed one bony finger towards the prisoners. Her fingernails were so long they twisted in a spiral, absurdly pointing back at her. The rear guard, understanding her gesture, dismounted and led the gang of children to the front, where they were inspected by the terrible witch. The prince watched, horrified, as she took the chain of prisoners from the guard, yanking the children forward into the thick blackened vines. Then, cloaking herself in lightning and smoke, she led the children deep into the thicket. The guards were stupefied, their faces twisted in shame and horror. Some turned and fled the scene in a complete break from military protocol. A horse spooked and jumped to a gallop, spilling itself and its rider into one of the emerald pools. Stuck in the mire and trying to free themselves, the prince watched as a giant bobbing head rose from the water. The thin golden hair of its beard splayed over the surface of the water like tendrils. It opened its mouth and spoke to the horse and rider, but the prince could not make out the words. Both horse and rider were still and staring at the bog in terror as the giant bobbing head sank beneath the surface of the water. Then they began to retch, and frogs belched from their mouths and poured from their rears. The sound of so many frogs was cacophonous, along with the splashing as they leapt into the bog. When they had finished, the prince saw that the horse had transformed into a stumpy dwarf, and the soldier into a large and ugly toad. The dwarf mounted the toad, and they lumbered towards the thicket. The prince's heart was racing. This was all too fantastic to take in. The remaining guards tried to keep calm while fleeing the marsh, so as to avoid the same fate, but the pillar of smoke grew tall, and the clouds darkened, and struck the ponds with flashes of red lightning. The entire cohort was sent into a wild gallop. Many fell into the pools and emerged as dwarves, riding giant frogs that made their way into the thickets to follow the smoke. Remembering the children, the young prince raced towards the towering smoke. Thorns tore at his clothing, causing him to stumble in the thick woody vines, and piercing his hands as he attempted to catch his fall. He watched in amazement as the thorn of the thirsty vine sucked the blood from his palm. He scrambled back to his feet and gathered his wits. He could see the pillar of smoke moving back the way it came. He recognized that the vampire vines, though wildly overgrown, were planted in rows. He could avoid their thorny daggers by walking between them. The prince thought of going back to the city to tell his father, the king, what he'd seen. But what he'd witnessed was a cohort of royal guards sent by the king's command to deliver children into the hands of a giant hag. Going back would be no less perilous than pursuing the creature cloaked in smoke. At least there was a chance he might rescue the children, or so the prince hoped. He wound his way forward with all the stealth he could muster, sidestepping the barbs of the blood vines, while not snapping the dead vines underfoot. He could hear the rhythmic clanging of chains as he drew near the procession, and the moaning and the sobs of the children. The prince, proud of how stealthy he'd been, snuck in close enough to see the prisoners 2 rows of thickets over. His mind was racing to form a plan to free them when he heard a muffled belch behind him. It caused the hair on the back of his neck to stand up. He turned, face first, into a reek of gas that warped the air. The stench turned his empty stomach inside out. Delirium was instantaneous, but the prince thought he was staring at a giant mucus-mouthed frog with a dwarven rider. He tried to hang on to consciousness, but the shock knocked him right out. Chapter 10. The Estate. He woke on a hard bed made of coarse straw. He was inside a small cabin not much larger than a storage shed. Gaps in the wooden slats of the wall let in beams of dusty gray light. He could see ash falling like snow through a small window in the door. From the looks of things, this was the product of the many bellowing chimneys scattered around the courtyard. A dwarf passed by, kicking up the ankle-high layer of fine dust covering the ground. The prince looked up, but didn't think the sun would ever penetrate the dense haze of wherever he was. He tried opening the door to the cabin. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. He walked into the courtyard lined with small cabins. He could see the dwarves pushing barrows of what looked like grapes to a massive barn at the far edge of the yard. Opposite the barn was a bog, where the heads of giant frogs peeked above the gaseous green water. Thickets of dark blood vines surrounded the yard, with paths leading into their maze. At the end of the courtyard was a large estate, made of brick, now blackened by soot. A large chimney belched plumes of smoke into the sky, and a strange sigil hung above the door. It had a weirding effect on the dimensions of the house, and the prince felt seasick looking at the warping outline of the building. The prince had seen buildings like this in the royal courts of the city. The gloom of this one made a proud mockery of the grandeur he was accustomed to from homes of this kind. There was no sight or sound of the children. Nonetheless, the prince wouldn't allow himself to think about the source of the smoke billowing from the chimneys as he walked towards the entrance to the estate. Chapter 11. Witch House. He entered the great house. It was dingy, and the air was stale. A greedy fire roared in a grand fireplace at the end of the great room. 2 hunched dwarves fed the fire with dead branches of the blood vines, which the fire gobbled up in tongues of white-green flames. The hearth produced little light and even less heat, for even these were consumed back into the jealous flame. The prince drew near, relieved that the fire was fed only by dead wood. "Come, come, my intrepid young prince," said a voice in the corner. From a dark corner of the room, the prince could make out the outline of the hag he'd seen emerge from the pillar of smoke in the marshes. As he drew closer, he saw her gangly form, impossibly hunched and twisted, neck and head pushed against the ceiling of the great room. Her lower body slumped on the large pile of dried vines, which she sat upon like a throne. The prince stood, not saying a word. "It's been a long age since one like you dared to visit me. A long age indeed since the king sent me one of his sons. He must be in great need to send me such a gift as you, young prince. I only wonder what he wants in return." "The king did not send me," the prince exclaimed, cutting off the broken voice of the hag. She leaned in, her head scraping the ceiling, flakes of ash and plaster dropping into her hair and onto the floor. The prince was horrified by the physics of this monster, her head and neck extending half the distance of the room from her bloated midsection. Thin straggles of hair draped over her face, her bulging eyes shining with an oozing green corona of light. her pupils squirming like salamanders in a bowl. He did not step back. He did not flinch. The prince stood tall and faced the witch. Terror rose in his spine as he commanded, "Release the children you took prisoner." Her head gave a violent twitch to the left and her eyes flashed with green rage. There was a tense silence, and the prince thought she might murder him with one swipe of her gnarled fingernails. Her face cooled, and her grin appeared, revealing a crooked grill of long, sharp teeth. Chapter 12. The Bargain. "Those children are mine by right. They are hard at work tending my precious vines," she said. "Your vines are fruitless and need no tending. Send the children home," said the prince. "You are mistaken, boy," she shouted in a terse and hellish tone. "You don't remember, do you? You know the sigil over my door. You've seen it many times before," said the witch. The prince had recognized it, but he couldn't recall where he'd seen it. "The fruit of my vines makes the finest wine. You have drunk it on many occasions, young prince. Your household prizes my wine above all others." It was true. The prince thought to himself as he remembered where he'd seen her sigil. It was branded on the side of barrels inside the royal storehouse. He had drunk this wine. Even now he could taste its rich and peppery bouquet on his tongue. The prince was ashamed as the memory of it awoke in him a deep thirst. "Now you see that I speak truly, young prince. You know that the blood pricked from the hands of my workers is what makes the fruit so plump and so dark. It's their innocence mixed with their suffering that balances the sweetness of the wine. And they are mine, by order of your father, the king." Her words scraped his ears like gravel. The prince was reeling from this revelation, feeling lightheaded and woozy, as if drunk on the wine itself. She clasped her bony hands, contemplating some scheme. And after a terrible silence, she said, "I am not unreasonable, my young prince. I will make you an offer. I will release the children, as you have asked, and my dwarves will escort them back to the realm, lest they befall a worse fate. I will do this if you will take their place and tend my vineyard for 7 years, after which I will consider our arrangement complete." The prince hailed from a long line of noble blood. Great courage rose in him, and he accepted her offer. A wide smile spread across her face, and she began to writhe and cackle, her green eyes lit with unholy greed. Chapter 13. The Children. She summoned a dwarf, bending low to whisper a command. The dwarf wobbled off and out of the house. The prince followed and watched as the children were brought from the vineyard into the courtyard. Their clothes were tattered and soiled with dry blood from the thirsty vines. A few of the children had juice stains around their lips from eating the grapes. These especially did not make eye contact with the prince. He was astounded that they should have achieved such a terrible state in mere days. The prince wondered if he'd saved them at all. The dwarves removed the shackles and mounted their giant toads, and led the children through the marshes. A young girl near the back of the procession turned to the prince. Her face was flushed, her cheeks rosy, and her deep sapphire eyes shone with wonder and gratitude. She made a slight bow toward him, then pointed over her shoulder in the direction of the tower. The dwarves urged them forward with a gruff command, and the children disappeared into the thicket, one after the other. The hag was standing behind the prince. She reeked of stale water, bitter spices, and charred blood. Her long, twisted fingernails slid over his shoulders, where her cold palms came to rest. The weight of it dropped the prince to his knees. Chapter 14. The Crown. 2 dwarves emerged from the barn carrying a small, charred wooden chest. In the time it took them to cross the courtyard, the prince imagined 1,000 terrible things that could be in the box. He was wrong about all of them. What the chest contained was far worse than anything he'd imagined. The hag stepped in front of the prince, snatching the chest from the dwarves. She opened the box and pulled from it a writhing mess of obsidian vipers, tangled into the shape of a crown. In a mock coronation, she held the undulating wreath over the head of the prince. This was more than he could bear. His constitution failed him, and his chest caved to his stomach as he began to sob in terror. The prince glanced up and through his tears saw that this was no wreath of vipers, but a vigorous and thorny crown of fresh blood vines. The witch placed the crown upon his head. At first the thorns tingled his skin, and then sank into his skull like hundreds of icy hot needles. So greedy were the young vines that not a spot of blood dripped from their wounds. The pain was so complete that the prince felt immediately numb. His only defense, to feel everything as though it were nothing. After receiving his crown, a few dwarves escorted the prince into a nearby row of blood vines to begin his work tending their branches and gathering their grapes. He would work until sundown, returning at the brink of exhaustion, half mad from the pain in his skull. Each evening upon his return, the crown was removed from his head. The witch would squeeze the fattened vines, wringing out the blood and sweat they'd collected onto her festering black tongue, riddled with crimson boils. The prince was forced to watch until the crown was placed back in the chest and he was sent to the winepress to tread the day's harvest before returning to his cold and dusty cabin to find what rest he could. Each morning, the crown would again be placed on his head, and he would be sent into the vineyard to pick the plump, blackish grapes, while his bare hands and feet were pricked and suckled by the thorns. Owing to his royal blood, the harvest was greater from this one prince than that of 70 others. For 7 long years, the prince bore that crown. Every day he picked the grapes of her vineyard and mashed them with his bare and bloodied feet in the dread winepress of her wrath. Owing to his great courage in fulfilling his vow, angels, hidden from the sight of the hag, visited the prince, giving him comfort, wisdom, and sharing with him many graces. The prince's suffering was turned to ecstasy many times in those 7 years, and the hag knew nothing of it, while she marveled at his constitution. Royal blood for the royal wine, the great hag watched with terrible greed and maddening wrath as the end of the prince's 7 years of servitude drew near. Never before had she produced a finer vintage, a wine mixed with the prince's many tears and the incessant cursing of the hag. Her hatred was her tannin, and the secret bitter beneath all other notes of the palate. So she began to plot and scheme how she might trick the prince into becoming her slave forever. End of Part 2. The Bloodvines. Part 3. The Tower. Chapter 15. End of Service. As the end of the prince's servitude approached, the hag of the vineyard became mad with fear and raged at the thought of losing the prince. His days spent feeding the vines with his blood and pruning them by his sweat produced the darkest and sweetest fruit the vineyard had ever grown. The vineyard was changing. The vines were greener and the prick of their thorns no longer painful. Feeding the vines had become like giving milk to a baby, and they needed very little of his blood to grow their juicy fruit. Rays of sunlight burned through the dense clouds, adding to the health of the vineyard. The prince was 7 days from fulfilling his oath, but the hag had every intention of keeping the prince until his skin turned gray, his blood thinned, and his soul dimmed to a shadow. Her obsession spiraled as the skies above thinned from dull charcoal to pearlescent silver. The dried blood vines she had burned to blot out the sun no longer produced the smoke they once did, and the silhouette of the sun threatened to burn off the remaining cloud cover any day now. The prince watched her madness progress with great concern, uncertain of what she might do to him in such a state. That evening, at the time of his uncrowning, the hag came to him and said, "My dear prince, you've served me well these 7 years. Together we've made the finest vintage in all my years tending this vineyard. Why not join me in this work a little longer? No longer as a prince, but as a king of my court. Yes, I will crown you king, not with your viper's crown, but with something suitable from the ancient storehouses of the great noble winemaker who tended this vineyard before me. We will produce the finest wine of any age, and our renown will never fade from living memory." The prince, guided by angels, had grown wise in his servitude. Seeing through her delusion as though it were a spider's web, he replied, "You know our deal. My blood earns my keep. I've served you these 7 years to free others from the miserable suffering you would have enslaved them by. I laid down my freedom to purchase theirs, and to ensure that you will never enslave another living soul. For, whether you know it or not, the deal we made ends not only my servitude, but all servitude in this place. You will honor the terms of our agreement, for it is an oath of blood, and to blood is your magic and life bound. I will renew my freedom and my quest for the tower 7 days from now." At the mention of the tower, the hag shrieked. She hated the tower, almost as much as she hated the sun. In her rage, she spoke. "You are a wretched and worthless prince, the runt of 7 brothers. You are so useless that your own father sent you here to me, and your mother said good riddance. Let the hag of the vineyard raise him. Pruning my vines is the only way you could bring honor to your bloodline. They let you escape. They wanted you gone. This was your purpose all along. You are nothing, nobody, and you will die here, a prince in the middle of nowhere. I will never let you go. In 7 days, I will have you bound to a post with fresh blood vines, and you will suffer as you have not yet suffered. I will bleed you to fresh and hungry vines for as long as your heart wills to beat in your chest. And when you finally give up hope, and the horror of your life is clear to you, I will eat your flesh and char your bones to flavor the next season's wine with your desecrated remains. And, in exchange for this royal vintage of exceptional quality, your depraved father, the king, will send me a fresh batch of noble children to take your place, proving your sacrifice utter vanity. I've been here a very long time, my prince, and by the blood of these vines I will survive a long time yet. You are but another fool from a long line of fools, and I curse the day you came to my courts." She spat these last words at the prince, who was mortified at the thought of being drunk as wine to celebrate the highest feasts in the realm by his own father and mother and sisters and brothers. Terrible as this thought was, he would give her no satisfaction of a response, nor would he utter another word. He would finish his part of the bargain in complete silence. If the hag could make good on her curses, and this was to be the end of his journey, so be it. But he thought the wiser of her. He perceived great fear behind her proclamation of his doom. She was bluffing, forever bound to her oath by the precious blood she now sought to steal from him by violence. The prince saw how the vineyard had changed after 7 years of his blood coursing through its vines. Health had returned to the vineyard. Vines once woody and brittle were now supple and flowering. The dead vines the hag incinerated to make cloud cover burned ever more clean, and ash no longer fell from the sky. Color had returned to the vineyard as the skies grew brighter. His blood was healing this place, and her power was at its end. Once their bargain was fulfilled, her blood magic would be broken. She would never again enslave another to serve her wicked winery. Hope, brighter than her lies, grew in his heart, and the prince knew he would soon renew his quest for the tower. A ray of sunlight warmed the back of his neck. He turned to the sky, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he squinted at the brightness of the sun. As the remaining days passed, the sky became clear. What remained of the witch's efforts to blot out the sun were threadbare wisps of smoke smearing the cloudless blue canopy. He watched as the dwarves tripled, then quintupled the stacks of dried vines for the furnaces. Even fully stoked, the chimneys bellowed nothing more than a smokeless vapor warping the air. Dwarves who drew near to feed the cold flames were scorched with frostbite. An icy mist lay low across the courtyard, making life miserable below the shins. At least until mid-morning, when the sun warmed the once ashen ground, now carpeted with moss and lavender. The hag avoided the sun, only coming out before dawn to crown the prince, and in the evening to remove the thorns and take her prize. But there was none. She squeezed the vines of his crown with all her might, but not a drop of blood came out. Her parched tongue was white, and the boils, once fat with blood, were empty, shriveled sacks. The prince was amazed at her transformation. She had wasted away, riddled by fear, always craning her neck to the sky in terror of the stars above in the clear night sky. Nearing the end, he no longer feared the witch, instead feeling pity for her, as it was obvious her end was nigh. All day long she cursed the clear skies from deep inside her house, in a tongue ancient and foul. The prince was thankful he did not know the language she spoke, but the sentiment was clear. He could see the tower deep on the horizon now. It seemed nearer than his eyes perceived, as if the tower had drawn closer to him. The prince reached into his secret pocket for the looking-glass, but dared not reveal it for fear of whatever tricks the hag may have left. On the morning of the 7th day, there was not a cloud in the sky. The dwarves gave up feeding the furnaces and took shelter in their shabby cabins from the light and heat of the day. The sun beamed on the tower, and by some synchronicity of the heavens, warm rays of prismatic light reflected from the tower onto the vineyard, giving the whole place an unearthly glow. It was well past the time for the hag to place the viper's crown on the prince's head, or make good on any of her threats. The door to her estate remained fast shut, and there was no sound from within. The prince was sure she would never leave the house in broad daylight, and she greatly feared the stars at night. The prince was free. He touched the numb scars on his head where the crown had sat. They did not ache in the warmth of the sunlight. He dusted himself off, remarking at how the still glittering royal clothes had served him so well. The fabric had miraculously healed itself of the many cuts and tears it suffered, and had grown with him into the body of a strong and fit young man. He looted provisions from the storehouses for the journey ahead, including a bottle of the finest wine, which he promised himself to only drink with the rusk of bread he'd received when he finally got where he was going. He loaded a pair of saddlebags and slung it over the back of a large toad. Mounting the beast, he set off into the brush towards the gleaming white tower before him. The toad hopped along, proving itself a more swift and steady steed than the prince imagined. After a full day's ride through the low brambles and thickets, the vineyard was long behind them, and the land was no longer desolate. They were surrounded by green leafy bushes, peppered with giant pink hydrangeas, and loaded with red berries that the prince ate with much enthusiasm. He delighted in the freedom of breathing the sweet, clean air, and relished the warmth of the sun on his face. The toad was snapping dragonflies from the air with the whip of its tongue. The prince did not look back, but he did play out the fate of the hag in his mind. He reasoned that if she could not blot out the sun, she would not be able to leave her estate, and, he assumed, without fresh vines to feed on, she would die of starvation, or bloodlust, or both. Either way, he was confident that her days were at an end. While he was correct in predicting her demise, the way in which the hag of the bloodvines met her end is a story for another day. Chapter 16. Shore's Edge. In what seemed no time at all, the prince and toad wandered a great distance from the memory of the vineyard. The beauty of the wilderness was glorious as they followed the path of the sun, behind them, above them, in front of them, before it finally set behind the mountains beyond the white tower. As the sun spilled its secrets into the twilight, The bushy hedges and sweet grasslands they meandered through thinned, and they found themselves on a breezy bluff overlooking the pebbled shores of a great lake. The prince scanned the shoreline with his looking-glass, but was unable to gauge the circumference of the waters. The two of them loped down the gentle bluff and set up camp on the beach. He gathered wood and warmed himself by the fire. The toad refreshed itself in the gentle waves of the lake, and together they watched the red embers of the dying sun and the purple shades of peak twilight drape the Protean sky. The prince watched the stars come out one by one, like tiny angels. He'd long felt the stars were his friends, all the more after seeing how terrified the hag was of them. Leaning back on a thick piece of driftwood, the prince fell into the most peaceful sleep of his adult life. Chapter 17. A Dream of the Tower. He awoke in a dream. The stars blazed above with a mad twinkle. The moon was the sliver of a dragon's eye, a light from beyond to watch him by. The lake seemed small as a pond. The tower, brilliant in a radiance all its own, was only a stone's throw from the young prince. And throw a stone he did, skipping it across the water where it landed on the glittering white beach of the far shore. Moon and starlight mingled in the ripples, spelling a word of some arcane language beyond the memory of men, and similar to the runes embossed on the shaft of his looking-glass. The keep of the tower flashed like a diamond in response to the rune, as a woman appeared at the far edge of the lake. She drew forth upon the waters, dipping a toe in each sigil as she moved. Her dress was indistinguishable from the lights of the night. Wordless, she beckoned the prince to come, and before doubt could raise any objection, the prince rose and walked across the water to meet her. A small wake followed as her big toe cut the glassy surface like a zipper, light following like the train of her dress. The prince too found himself skimming across the water, but with far less grace, as evidenced by the white water of his own wake. The prince met the luminous lady in the middle of the lake, keeping a safe distance from her terrible beauty. Hovering over the water, she pointed his gaze toward the tower. The prince retrieved the looking-glass from his secret pocket to take a closer look at the tower. He could see there was much activity at its base. "Do you see them?" she asked. "Yes," said the prince. To the left of the tower, he saw 7 radiant sisters, some younger, some older, frolicking in the fairy lights of a great garden, each one adorned in garments of silver and gold, mixed with star and moonlight, and bejeweled with fine gems of amber, topaz, and emerald. "These are my daughters, you see." Shocked, the prince replied, "How can it be? You do not look old enough for daughters." As he said the words, he sank to his knees in the icy water. Fear of the deep rushed him like a leaky vessel, but the lady of the lake extended her hand and drew him to his feet again. Wizened up to a proper reverence for his guide, he quietly thanked her for saving him. "You are a great fool, young prince, a great fool indeed. You know not what you see, and you know not what you seek. Yet you would give away your entire life for a chance to climb the White Tower. I see this looking-glass of yours has bewitched you from a young age." "My lady," the prince asked, "may I ask who you are, and why do you come to me?" He once again began to sink, but managed to lift his chest and step back upon the surface of the water. He dared to look upon her face from the corner of his eye. She was timeless, neither young nor old. Her hair was a shimmer of platinum curls. Her features bore the marks of character, but no tiredness of age. Her sapphire eyes held a perpetual twilight to scorn the blackest night. They reminded him of the eyes of the young girl who'd bowed to him when she and the rest of the children were freed from the terrible vineyard. "I've come to show you a peek of what you seek and no more. Look upon the tower gates with your glass and tell me what you see." The prince glassed the keep atop the tower. The glow of firelight danced on the walls, barely visible from the windows. He traced the steps of the staircase, winding their way down from the keep. The mountains beyond, an ominous silhouette, darker than night. Then, zooming out, were the 11 crystal monoliths, standing like sentinels before the gem-encrusted gate, which the prince noticed was slightly ajar. Finally, on the sandy ground in front of the tower, he saw strong men with hammer and chisel, shaping the stones which had fallen from the tower. His gaze returned to the garden, extending into the valley of the mountains beyond the tower, and the 7 young women dancing and singing with unspeakable joy inside its open gate. The prince was sure he loved them, like sisters, like brides. The Lady of the Lake spoke. "Do not gaze long, young prince. Many a soul has been snatched away by the object of a gaze too deep. Again I say, tell me what you see." "I see strong men working the stones scattered before the tower, and young maidens dancing and singing in a great and beautiful garden." Again she spoke. "The men you see are shaping the bricks fallen from the tower. Some can be salvaged and refitted for the tower walls. Others will be used for lesser things. Some will be ground to dust and join with the sand beneath them. My daughters are the virtues, each one at play with each other, and all living things. I tell you a mystery. Of my 7 daughters, only one may ascend the tower. Do you know who of them she is? Do you know her name? Do you know who I am, fair and foolish prince? Do you know my name?" The prince bowed his head and could not answer. "Speak my name, dear prince. Before the end you must name me aright, lest you get every name wrong for as long as your short days and foolish tongue permit." He could not speak in her presence. He was in awe before her waxing beauty, and that of the now half-moon. He began to sink, but he did not say her name. The cold took his breath as he dipped to his chest in the dark waters, but he dared not say her name. His chin floated on the surface, forcing him to look up as she towered over him. Her hair mingled with the light of the now full moon and the white, hot stars. Water touched his lips, and with his last breath he wished to say her name. His mouth gurgled a desperate word as he sank into the depths of what he'd forgotten was a dream. The light rippled above him, then exploded in a wash of bubbles as he choked for breath. The prince awoke, gasping for air. Toad, staring at him from the frothy shore, belched a concerned ribbit. Chapter 18. Wandering the Shore. A blue dawn was swift upon the cloudless sky, culling the twinkle from the stars and relieving the pale moon of its duties. Wisps of faint smoke puffed from the dying embers of the fire. The prince reached into his saddlebags for a biscuit, ate it, and mounted the Toad. Together they headed up the shore. Days went by, but the shore only continued. The days were hot and the nights chilly from a breeze off the lake. Driftwood for the fire was scarce and did not last the night. The prince was careful to ration the food he'd taken from the estate, but he knew they were unlikely to last whatever circumference of shore it would take to land them in front of the tower. Around noon on the 5th day, they stopped for lunch. Toad was happy for the break, as it meant he could nab dragonflies out of the air with undivided attention. The prince walked in the white wash of the beachhead with his bare feet. He glassed the tower, but it seemed further away now and shrouded in a haze beyond the horizon. His heart sank. The tower had been so near in the prince's dream that first night they arrived on the shore. The prince had no idea what to do. He began to resent the luminous lady from his dream. Why had she come, if not to show him a way to the tower? Also, she'd been quite rude, calling him a blind fool and such. He was a great prince of the realm, and he'd given up everything to gain the tower, his home, his family, and 7 years of servitude to an evil wine witch. A blind fool indeed. The words cracked from his parched throat. He realized he'd not said a word aloud since taking his vow of silence in the vineyard. The toad croaked in mocking response. The prince remembered in his dream how he could skip a stone to the far shore. So he picked up a stone and slung it across the water, skipping it 7, 10, and 22 times. Then a thought came to him, one so obvious that he shook his head in disbelief. He looked at the toad, and the toad looked back with apprehension. The prince walked into the foamy water at the shore, mounted the toad, and steered him into the lake. Toad leapt into the small waves, making a terrible splash, but soon the water was deep enough that he began to glide across the water towards the great white tower. Every few hours he glassed the tower, but it seemed no closer. The toad happily swam along, but the prince knew it was only a matter of time until fatigue set in. He grew anxious as night fell, but the toad kept on towards the spire at the edge of the world. The prince laid his head on the clammy skin of the toad and slept. Chapter 19. The Island. He awoke the next morning, his hair and head damp from their pillow of mucus-coated skin. The prince was shocked to find the toad still swimming with great vigor. He looked up and in the distance saw land. It was not the shore where the tower lay, but an island blocking his view of the tower. The prince glassed the island several times, looking for signs of life. He saw sandy beaches, and beyond them a dense forest of tropical trees. Birds flew about. As he watched them fly, he noticed thin wisps of smoke high up in the forest. He tried to zoom in when Toad bucked, and the looking glass slipped from his hand and fell into the water. His heart skipped a beat, but when he looked down, he saw his prized possession lying there in the shallow water of the sandbar they had landed upon. He reached down, fishing it from the sandy bottom. The water was refreshing in the hot morning sun, so he swam the short distance to the shore. Toad leapt, splashing its way to the beach, and rested while the prince swam ashore. The prince undressed, drying his clothes on a nearby tree, while feeling the hot sun on his body as he ate a simple breakfast. A mix of joy and grief was felt as he surveyed the many scars across his flesh from the blood vines. They were a reminder of how much he'd suffered for the sake of the children. He thought again of the young woman who gazed at him with such thankfulness. She'd pointed toward the tower, and here he was making progress at last, or so he thought. He said a prayer for her, as he often did, tracing a cross in the sand. The gods of his youth, the ones worshipped in the city, had seemed distant, hard, mischievous. More a formal decoration for the royal house than anything believable as God. The wise men only spoke of the gods as principles and powers, never as persons. But in his time tending the blood vines, the prince learned much of the elemental ways of the world, the blood magic the hag used to preserve her powers, but also of the higher powers, those which served the Great One, and they taught him to make this sign. This god had taken mercy on the prince because of the terrible sacrifice he'd made. He sent angels to comfort him in the fields and to balm his wounds at night, where the crown had left its mark. This was the secret to his courage all those years, and his life in the vineyard had become a kind of living prayer. And the hag knew nothing of this. His clothes were dry, and he got dressed. The prince could hardly believe they'd not become shabby. The silver threads and the embroidered gems gleamed in the radiance of the sun, and the royal blue fabric was worn in but unfaded. He was proud of the sartorial craftsmanship of his house. The prince scanned the forest for any indication of a path which could lead to the source of the smoke in the hills. A narrow trail seemed to open just ahead. He told Toad to wait for him to return. It seemed to understand from its spot in a sandy lagoon, snatching insects from the air. The prince cleared a few trees with a stick and found what looked like a trail. It was a steep and sweaty climb, requiring constant bushwhacking and stomping over fallen trees. When he finally emerged into a clearing, the afternoon sun was high in the sky and a cool breeze chilled the sweat. He saw slim coils of white smoke rising from the chimney of a nearby cabin. Looking further up the hill, he saw a dome-like building. The prince recognized it at once as an observatory, like the one in the royal courts of the city. The door to the cabin was open, and he entered. Inside there was a bed freshly made, a wood cooking stove with a steaming kettle, and a desk beside a library with many books. No one was home, so the prince made his way up the hill to the observatory in search of whoever was the keeper of this place. The strong breeze at these heights cooled him, and his irritability from the jungle hike was forgotten. Chapter 20. The Observatory. The observatory was a round concrete building topped by a smoky bronze glass dome, mirroring the blue sky and lazy clouds. The prince gazed at the monolith for a long, sweet moment. Then he walked the circumference of the building until he found a simple door offset into the wall. The prince entered. In the middle of the room was a large mechanical oculus. Two arms at the center held a massive telescope tilted to the sky, while many smaller arms supported an array of telescopes, some with rotating sets of precision lenses, some fit with kaleidoscopes. Each device pointed at the sky, under the smoky glass dome filtering the sunlight into a kind of synthesized golden hour. The entire apparatus was on a swivel platform. A brass captain's chair surrounded by levers, knobs, and push-buttons was in the center. The prince watched as a flock of exotic birds with long feathered tails passed above, their features magnified by the curvature of the glass dome. He smiled in amazement. The room was impressive, magical even. An ornate wooden cabinet, showcasing looking glasses much like his own, caught his attention. He counted 41 in all, with the room for one more. Adjacent to the cabinet was a work table, where wood and metal parts, mirrors, lenses, and glass orbs lay in stages of preparation to become looking glasses or kaleidoscopes. The prince didn't have long to explore before three small creatures shuffled into the room. They looked a little like bears, but had tails like a monkey. They walked on two legs, and their faces were flat. They reminded the prince of toys he'd had as a child. "Welcome, welcome, welcome," they said in unison. Then the tallest one spoke, saying, "The glassmaker welcomes you." The prince could see the mouths of the other two singing in harmony as the taller one spoke. "He is on his way. He won't delay. Come along, it won't take long." "Where are we going? Do you have names, my friends?" the prince asked. The taller bear spoke, while the other two sang the words. "Names are very precious things. We've not received ours yet. We hope to be named one day, but that day has not been set. We are thrice humble servants of the great Lord of Glass. He is a man of many wonders, and wisdom unsurpassed. As for where we're off to, now that you have asked, we'll take you to your lodging in the cabin that you passed. It's yours as long as you stay, and stay as long as you want. You'll find rest here on this island, and wisdom's perfect font." The prince smiled at the creatures and said, "All right then, thrice humble, lead the way." And so they led the prince back to the cabin. One of the humbles took the boiled water and made tea for the prince. One of them freshened the bed, tucking the corners of the sheets and fluffing the pillow, while the tall one showed the prince the many splendid tomes on the bookshelves. "Here you'll find books of various kinds, the secret lore of many worlds to wizen your mind. There's no end to the books that are written. He finds more all the time. The great Lord of Glass collects knowledge, like some men store fine wine." The prince's scar flared at the reference to wine, and he winced. He thanked the thrice humbles, dismissing them, and sat down at the tiny desk to read. Chapter 21. The Wizard and the Prince. Hours passed. The prince gorged himself on the words of those books. His tea was cold when he finally reached over for a sip. In these works was knowledge so pure he could only conclude the wise men of the city complete dullards, or that their job was actually to keep the young royals from the truth by great effort. "It is the latter," said a voice at the door. The prince nearly fell off his chair as he swiveled to see who'd spoken. "I know what you're thinking. I thought the same thing when I read that book. The wise men of the city are wise only in their ability to conceal true knowledge. The prince stood, mouth agape, staring at a man who looked quite like the wizards of children's books. His straight white beard fell long over his deep blue cloak, shimmering with embroidered diamonds, sapphires, and rubies, displayed in intricate patterns of celestial bodies. The silver threads sewn into his regal robes were in the spelling of runes similar to those inscribed on his looking-glass. By some instinct, the prince pulled the glass from his secret pocket and held it out towards the wizard. "You made this, didn't you?" The wizard drew near to inspect the glass, but did not take it in hand. "Yes. How wonderful. I've not seen this piece in untold years. What a special gift you have there, young prince. I made that so many years ago. I imagine you've seen many wonders with this device. Would you care to see more?" The prince could not conceal his joy at the invitation and said, "Very much so. I want to know everything." The wizard chuckled. Good then. There's no time to waste, my dear prince. Let's head up to my observatory and take a look at the stars." The prince followed the wizard out the door of his cabin, where the thrice humbles were waiting. They followed the pair in silence to the observatory as day became dusk. In their short walk, the prince learned that this wizard of glass had once been a noble in the city. He told the story of how he'd trained as an apprentice of the master glassmaker of the Royal Observatory before escaping to the island. In those days, it was the custom of the wise men to read the stars for signs and omens to bring to the king. Late at night, after the master glassmaker and the other wise men left their celestial studies, I was left to perform basic tasks inside the observatory. It was then, in the heart of night, that I would peer into the sky with the great oculus to interpret the twinkle of the stars. I learned the true language of the night and listened to the stars speak of all the happenings across the world. I was afraid to tell my master all I'd seen. He was a strict man and would have removed me from my post at the first hint of these nightly curiosities. Neither the glassmaker nor the wise men of the city had any interest in the language of the stars. They cared only for their predictions and how to use them to gain favor with the king and his court. In this way, they maintained their high position within the realm. They were grooming me to be a master glassmaker. However, I knew my appetite for knowledge would eventually be my downfall, and the thought of assisting the so-called wise men in their endless prattlings seemed a fate worse than death. So I devised a plan to leave the city and build a great oculus, one to discover the knowledge of the whole cosmos. It took years to plan my escape from the city. I prepared everything down to the last detail. I eventually exceeded the knowledge of the master glassmaker without ever letting on just how much I knew. Using the observatory to map the stars, I found the perfect island where there would be abundant resources for sustaining life and a place rich in fine sand for glassmaking. I collected the rest of what was needed to build the observatory from around the city, storing the supplies in a secret location in the lower circles of the city until the time was right to leave. On the morning of the summer solstice, 12 years from the inception of my master plan, I set out from the city with a caravan of supplies, under the guise of a royal delivery for a nearby trading village. I crossed the vast wilderness and disappeared from sight, never to be seen or heard from again. The prince, wonderstruck by the wizard's story, was shocked by how much of what was known about the world had been deliberately hidden from him as a boy, and asked, "Why would they hide the truth from me? I'm a prince of the royal house. Didn't I deserve to know the truth about the world outside the walls of the city?" asked the prince. The wizard answered, "My dear prince, that you are the king's son means you were raised for one purpose, and that is to manage the affairs of your father's house. Being the youngest of 7 means you were never destined for any great office, whereby these external realities would be your purview. I had the advantage of the observatory. I saw many things that only a handful of others were privy to, and I learned the true meaning of what I saw. That is why I took such a serious risk making your looking glass. I wanted someone else to see what I see, lest I serve only myself with such wonderful knowledge. Had your glass fallen into the wrong hands, I would have been found out, and my plan would likely have failed. Therefore, I engraved its shaft with powerful star speech, a process known as light scribing. You feel the power of those markings every time your fingers trace the surface of your relic. Those runes ward off the attention of those who would do harm, either through malicious intent or simple ignorance. They deliver an enchantment upon those of great imagination and pure heart. Each symbol is a coordinate on a celestial map. The glass you have in your pocket always points towards the heart's greatest desire. This is how you found this place and why you are now here. At these words, the prince felt great vindication for the impulse which had drawn him on this adventure. Also, the Wizard of Glass understood the prince, and for the first time the prince felt known. He felt a great desire to know all the wizard knows, and to see all the wizard sees. And so it was that the wizard and the prince set to work under the black dome of the observatory in the deep of night. Chapter 22. The Observatory at Night. The wizard pulled a lever from the console at the center of the oculus, and one of the large telescopes swung to the left and up towards the sky. The dome streaked in starlight at the movement of the telescope. The wizard turned a large dial, and the fuzzy stars came into such white-hot focus that the prince raised his hand to shade his eyes from the intensity. The wizard pressed down a foot pedal at the base of the console, and the brightness of the stars dimmed to a twinkle, pulsing their meaning onto the dome display as if knocking on the window. And the prince saw that behind them many other things moved in the darkness. "Do you see it?" asked the wizard. The prince answered, "I see many things." "Do you see the nature of the sky? Do you see what it is?" the wizard asked. "I see that the sky is deep waters. The stars are beings of pure light, swimming in inky waters. Their movements are a signal of information that I cannot decipher. Beyond them, deeper still, I see terrible, formless shapes moving in the dark." "You see correctly, my prince. But is this what was taught to you by the so-called wise men of your youth? No, for this is the terror they seek to hide from all men. They fear more than anything the flood of those waters and what lurks in the deep. Pay this little heed. They fear what they do not know. But I assure you, when those waters fall, and fall they will, we will be safe here on the island. Would you care to join me in reading the stars? Together with the sun and the moon, they hold all the information for life, and all the history of the world." The prince could only think to ask, "What about my toad? I can't just leave him on the beach." The wizard laughed. "Your toad will be fine. I'll send my servants to bring your things, and they will speak to your toad and let him know he's free to roam the island as he pleases." The prince, eager to learn, heartily agreed to help with the work in the observatory. Well, all thought of the tower slipped from his mind. Each day they would conclude their work just before dawn. Then the prince would head to his freshly made bed and sleep until mid-morning, usually waking to the sound of boiling teapot and savory smells of breakfast. The thrice humbles tended to his every need. After breakfast, the prince would settle in to study the results of the previous evening's work, or to read from the near endless selection on his bookshelf. He would take long walks around the island to clear his mind, visiting the beaches with a faint hope of seeing Toad again. He rarely saw the wizard during the day, the few exceptions being in the food gardens and the glass foundry where he would teach the young prince the art of glassmaking. In the evenings he learned the art of light scribing, arcane markings on looking glasses with coordinates that corresponded to the map of the stars. This rhythm of life went on for months and might have continued for a lifetime if the prince had not reached into his weathered and water-stained saddlebags one morning and pulled out the handkerchief with the rusk of bread he'd given with the instruction not to eat it until he got where he was going. The prince thought at the time that meant the tower, but he'd not seen the looming spires since his work with the wizard began. Maybe this was the place where he was going after all, and it was time to share with the wizard this meager gift, along with the wine. So the prince set both items aside, planning to bring them to dinner. That evening the wizard was seated at the outdoor table of the cliffside patio near the observatory, taking in the last rays of sun upon the waters beyond. This view didn't face the tower. To see the tower, one had to visit the opposite side of the island, and it was a difficult half-day journey to get to the steep cliffs and rocky shores of that place. The prince sat himself at the table, and they both enjoyed a moment of quiet, taking in the purple skies, blood-orange clouds low on the horizon. The prince broke the silence by unfolding the cloth to reveal the small rusk and asked the wizard if he'd met the bread man. "Who is this bread man?" he responded, and the prince told him the story of the mysterious figure. The wizard looked at the prince with consternation. "I'm unaware of this bread man, though if I were to guess, I'd say he's one of the Toma, those who travel between worlds by the music of the stars. I've only heard of them in legend, though I would greatly like to examine this artifact of bread under a microglass this evening, if what you say is true." Then the prince pulled out the wine from his bag, placing it on the table. The wizard's eyes grew wide with surprise, and the prince saw flash in them the white flame of desire. "Now that is a sight I've not seen in far too long, and something I've longed to taste for longer still. I was a young man the last time I drank the royal wine," said the wizard. "Never in all the world was a finer vintage produced. And do you know how it was made?" the prince asked. "What I know of worldly matters is by way of the stars. I've heard rumors of the vineyard, echoes from the stars, and hints of foul things done there. What I do know, young prince, is that we really ought to uncork that bottle." And he sent the humbles to fetch a corkscrew. The prince grew hesitant and asked, "And what of the great white watchtower? You've not spoken of it since I arrived. Seeking the tower is the reason I landed on your shores." At the mention of the tower, the wizard's brow furrowed. One of the humbles brought the corkscrew. "Oh, what can I say of the White Tower? I've not considered it, not since I made your looking glass. I only ever thought of it as a childhood fascination, a ruin from another age. You know, young prince, this conversation would be much better over wine." The prince put a hand over the top of the bottle, brushing aside the corkscrew hovering above. "Just a moment, thrice humble. I would hear the story of the tower before sharing this bread and wine." The wizard was taken back by the prince's revocation of his gifts, and a flush of desperation washed across his face. He was speechless. "I'm afraid, dear wizard, these gifts are for another time and place. Forgive me. I was mistaken, thinking I could stay here so long. I've learned much from you of the true knowledge of this world and the navigation of the stars. Please forgive me. I've forgotten my first love, that to which my looking glass points, the tower." The wizard looked sad. "I'd hoped you'd stay, dear prince. So few have ventured to this island, and none of them have come to know what I know, for they all turned back after a time and lost their way. Only one has come who showed real promise to be my apprentice, and that is you. But I see that you must continue your journey to the mythic tower. It is often said, many walk, few set a path. One will complete the journey. I do not begrudge you the tower, young prince, for I see your heart is set upon it, and this by the work of my own looking glass. Forgive me for distracting you these many months, and permit me to make it up to you. I may yet be of aid in your pursuit. For your heart's desire is one thing, but the means to accomplish your task are quite another. I will draw you a map to the tower, but I require a few more days to prepare. Work with me, and together we will map the stars to find your way there. The place you are going is not purely of this world, and getting there from here will not be straightforward. I ask you one thing in return. When you get where you're going, send the looking glass back to the city so that another may find the tower, and maybe visit this island along the way." The prince agreed, and they immediately set to work charting the stars to find a course to the tower. It had not occurred to the prince that the tower sat outside this world. He realized that Without the wizard, his quest would have ended in vain. For, in distances measured by men, he'd come no closer to the tower than staring out the window of his childhood room. "There are many paths to the tower," said the wizard. "Some shorter and easier, some further and harder, and many yet unknown. Traveling between realms is a progression through a pattern. You must find the right pieces of the puzzle, and there's no guarantee you'll make them fit. Whatever path you choose will be perilous, no matter the route. Take the stars as your guide and remember the stage of the moon. The moon has much to do with where one is drawn to. I like to say it's always a full moon somewhere. When you see a radical change in the moon's cycle, you know you've moved between realms." However, none of this matters unless you complete your first challenge, leaving this island. Over the next 3 days, they rendered a mandala of the stars. At the center of this map, like the eye of a storm, stood the tower. It was the heart of many overlapping worlds. The prince pondered the symmetry of the cosmos before him and turned over in his mind the various routes from the island to the tower. "It is not for me to say which way to go, young prince. There are longer ways that may get you there faster, and shorter paths that leave you unprepared for what you'll find. You must discern in your own heart the path you will take," said the wizard. "Thank you for your kindness and wisdom, my friend. I've chosen my road to the White Tower," replied the prince. And with map in hand, the prince retired to his cabin for his last night on the island. Chapter 23. Journey to the Shore. After a dreamless sleep, he awoke to find his saddlebags packed with fresh rations. He slung them over his shoulders, wondering what became of Toad. The morning dew was still wet when the wizard and Thrice Humbles met the prince outside his door. They walked in silence toward the craggy edge of the island, facing the tower. The wizard broke the silence. "There's something I must tell you. I tried to leave the island once. I wanted to explore one of the many wonderful places I'd found while mapping the stars. It was a secret cave just outside paradise, filled with great treasures and powerful artifacts from the first days of man. As I prepared to cast off from the shore, a terrible sea dragon arose from the waters and mocked my attempt to reach the cave of treasures. I was terrified, and my courage left me. I turned back before my feet had touched the water. All my hair turned white that day. I say this to you now because you seek a thing beyond the world of mortals. The treasures of these realms are well guarded by creatures long forgotten and estranged from our kind. To succeed on your quest, your courage must exceed my own, and I fear even that may not be enough." Though the prince did not show it, he was disheartened by the wizard's words. Thoughts of living out his days in a peaceful existence on the island buzzed his mind like flies. Then he felt a looking-glass in his pocket, and the distracted thoughts fled. This treasure was his for a purpose greater than all the knowledge in the world. He glanced behind him at Thrice Humbles, and the lead humble gave him a nod of assurance. It was a comforting gesture, and the prince banished all but the thought of the tower from his mind. During the half-day journey, they descended rugged cliffs and passed through mossy caves, finally ending up on a calcified beach made of pulverized fish bones, the same pale white as the spire on the distant shore. The wizard motioned up the shore to a small sailboat pulled high up on the beach. The prince watched as the three humbles pushed and pulled it down to the water's edge. The wizard scanned the coast for any sign of the beast which had turned his hair white all those years ago. The prince loaded the saddlebags into the boat and raised the sail. It was the same deep blue fabric of the wizard's cloak, the same fabric the prince wore, and he could make out silver threads in elaborate patterns throughout the sail. "What is this?" the prince asked. "Ah, it's one of my greatest inventions," said the wizard. "This is no normal sail, dear prince. I made it for just this kind of journey. The patterns will mimic any destination you choose from your map. Invoke the destination in star speak, and the light scribing of the sail will change to match your map. Steer with the rudder, following the navigation of the heavens like I've taught you, and the sail will fill with etheric winds, drawing you to your destination." "Thank you, dear wizard. I remember you from high upon the tower. I will signal you with fire from its keep and let you know I've arrived. Watch for me at twilight on the full moon of the summer solstice," said the prince. "There's one more thing, a clever touch I added. There's a small flag on the mast that when you raise it will summon fish to your boat. Use it whenever you're hungry and save your rations for whatever land lies beyond. Of course, I never had a chance to try it on the water, but the magic is sound." "That really is something," said the prince. "I would ask you how you made such a thing, but our time is at an end." Chapter 24. The Prince Sets Sail. They said their farewells and set the boat upon the water. The prince spoke the route on the map that he had chosen, and the sail took the sigil of a swirling pool of watery stars. The sight of it was ominous. The prince had set course for the eye of a storm. The raised sail began to fill with winds not entirely of this world, giving off a foreboding sense of impressive danger. Even the wizard and thrice humbles could not hide their concern. The prince set sail, and the boat was swift upon the water. It wasn't long before his friends could no longer be seen on the distant shore, and the island vanished from view. He sailed into a moonless night, the stars reflecting across the water like a mirror. The prince had no fear of the night, for the stars were his angels. He read their chatter, each one such an earnest messenger. He watched their lights stretch and pull on the tiny waves cut by the rudder. Strands of electric white traced erratic patterns in the black, and the prince fell into a light trance. His gaze narrowed, and a faint temptation to dive into the waters visited the periphery of his mind, but he resisted this madness. After a time, the prince lifted his eyes a little, and saw another ripple of light, tracing a parallel path to his own. Something was skipping across the portside waters. He steered the boat towards the creature to get a better look, but as soon as he neared, the creature dove out of sight. The prince scanned the black waters, dappled with starlight, but to no avail. The creature was gone. Then, turning to view the wake behind the boat, he saw the creature skimming across the surface of the water, her naked body part woman, part sea creature, glowing like a black opal. She was staring right through him, eyes glowing a pale emerald green. In the moonless night he could see she had brilliant golden hair, long and stormy. This creature was brazen in her beauty, naked and shameless, something unearthly. "Mermaidens," the prince said to himself. "I've seen a mermaiden." Then she dived into the deep, and the prince did not see her again that night. Feeling no danger from the creature, he took his rest, falling into the oblivion of sleep. He awoke to a blood-red sky cut by fingers of black clouds that mirrored the ominous sigil of the whirlpool, still glowing on the sail. The day broke, and the hungry prince decided to raise the small sail. Within moments, the waters began to boil, and fish began leaping into the boat. The prince quickly lowered the flag and began tossing the many fish back into the sea, keeping one that he cooked for his breakfast. Later that day, the novelty of a full belly wore off, and boredom set in. And the prince began to sing songs from his childhood, songs of great knights and legends of war, silly songs, and songs about made-up monsters beyond the city walls, now knowing that some of them were all too real. Chapter 25. The Song of Paper Boats. He sang one of his favorites, about the grand pool in the royal courtyard. At its corners stood tall fountains made of rare black marble, with veins of emerald and gold running through it. Each fountain was hand-carved into the image of a beautiful mermaiden. From each of their mouths poured water that fell into the large bowls they held. The water overflowed the bowls into channels winding down their serpentine legs and into the crystal waters filling the pool. A rich mosaic, not unlike the sigil of his sail, was at the center, where the water drained into a whirlpool that fed the fountains in a continuous loop. The prince was told the water circulated by way of a rare celestial event, causing the water to return to the tops of the fountains. The prince now understood the world was full of these kinds of occurrences. thinnies, the wizard had called them, places where two or more realms met in a kind of push and pull that result in interesting phenomena of many kinds. As a boy, he and the other children liked to make paper boats that circled the waters until disappearing into the whirlpool. They would wait until eventually the boats would be spit from the fountains, eventually falling back into the pool below. He was deep in reverie for those days, tears streaming as he sang. Then he heard other voices join him in song. They were faint at first, but grew into a full choir. He turned his head to see the mermaiden from the previous night, and her companions following his boat and singing along as they skipped across the waters. He gasped at their beauty, their black opal bodies shimmering with pearlescence. He could see now their legs extending like dragon tails, each one spiraling the other in a graceful dance as they skimmed across the surface of the water. He stopped singing, stunned by the gaze of the emerald green eyes of one of the mermaidens. They continued to sing, their voices entwined in complex harmonies far surpassing his simple nursery rhyme. Melodies of sorrow were interwoven in harmonies of ecstatic joy, in a range beyond any mortal voice. The prince wept at the hearing. His scars tingled with sensation, remembering the cruelty of the blood vines, feeling as if the crown were placed again upon his head. Then it felt as if the crown was lifted and his head was drawn to the heavens by their siren song. He felt an urge to dive into the waters and join them. Resisting this madness became nigh impossible the longer they sang. His imagination was filled with vivid fantasies of breathing underwater and seeing all the wonders of their kingdom under the sea. He wanted nothing more than to swim hand in hand with the sea maidens to the lights of the deep, which he saw in the water below. Then, at the very moment his will had been drowned by their song, they fell silent, diving under the water in unison. Then the luminescence of the water faded. The prince's heart sank like a stone at their departure, and he felt cold, inside and out. The horizon was now an ominous charcoal. Streaks of matching clouds swirled the sky like fat fingers, reaching in vain for the sun. The prince felt uneasy. He could see neither sun nor the tower in what was apparently a gathering storm. The winds and the waves remained calm, but for how long, he wondered. He was hungry, so he raised the flag. The waters roiled, and fish leapt at the boat, but not like before. These were razor-fanged silverfish with sharp wings. He ducked just in time as one nearly sliced his head off. Another landed in the boat and bit his leg. The prince yelled and batted the fish back into the deep. It had drawn blood. He looked up and saw fish flying through the air and tearing through the sail. One of them tore a hole through the center of the sigil. The prince leapt to the rope which hoisted the flag and began to pull it down. A flying fish took the flag in its mouth before splashing back into the waters. He kicked the flopping fish from the boat. Then, looking up, he saw the sail in tatters. Without the etheric winds in his sail, the boat was adrift, in whatever realm this was. The pain from his wounds rushed to his senses as the adrenaline wore off. But his wounds were not deep. The real pain came from how stupid and helpless he now felt, remembering the words of the hag, "You are a prince in the middle of nowhere." The sky grew dark and the waves began to chop at the boat on all sides, making it bob and dip in unpredictable patterns that made him seasick. The prince sat in numb silence as the blackest night he'd ever known set in. A cold rain fell and the prince huddled, clutching his knees and trying to stay warm by his small cooking flame. His teeth chattered and his body shuddered as he again took up the song of the paper boats in the royal pool. He sang with bitterness and a sense of irony that he was in the paper boat that was now circling the drain. As he sang, he thought he heard the choir of the sea maidens. The sea began to glow with luminescence, and he looked into the water to see the mermaidens swimming in circles beneath his boat. But their song was now a dirge, and his boat began to spin in the gathering storm. The waters drew up on all sides as a whirlpool began to form. His boat began to spin faster and tilt. The prince could see a great host of mermaidens circling in waters below. Their song, low and full of terror, gripped his heart. Then, at the climax of their unearthly dirge, came the most unexpected 3 notes, a chord of perfect peace. They held this chord as the boat spiraled, tilted, and capsized in the swirling sinkhole. The prince was plunged into the whirlpool, and the chord was drowned in a rush of bubbles. Then silence as he was pulled deeper into the dark waters and slipped from the conscious world. Chapter 26. The Sands Before the Tower. The prince was aware of himself in total darkness amidst a calming wet cold. This must be death's lobby, he thought. There was a clammy cold sensation on his left cheek. The tips of his fingers dipped in running water, as his hazy mind loitered in this boundaryless void. Other senses shuffled in, a warmth on the back of his neck, a cool breeze flipping locks of hair, and a crisp, wet splashing upon his lips that hit with a tang of salt. Peeling his eyes open and pulling his face from the slimy pillow it lay upon, he found his body clinging to Toad, while they rested in the lapping waves of the shore. He pulled himself up to a seated position on Toad's warty back, dumbstruck that he was alive. He tried to thank the Toad for rescuing him, but his voice cracked like broken leather into a fit of coughing. Toad answered the gesture with a ribbit, which the prince took to mean, "You're welcome." He saw the Toad had also rescued his saddlebags, and that his provisions were well preserved, the watertight pockets so cleverly devised by the witch of the vineyard for the protection of her sordid cargo. The prince tried to stand, but his legs were numb. He waited through the painful tingle as they awoke, then got shakily to his feet and scanned the endless glittering beach. This was not the beach nor the waters they had left so many moons ago. This sand was made of diamonds, and bright as the tower itself in the late morning sun. His eyes could not take in half the brightness of this place, but they adjusted enough to see the tower. It was very close now. The great sands in front of the tower were just beyond the brilliant sands of the beachhead. Even without his looking glass, he could make out the ornate runes of its bejeweled gates. The 11 crystal pillars in the sands before the tower were giant beams of light. These monoliths seemed to be the reason everything around was painfully bright. The prince stumbled forward, his legs still weak and sore from the fish bites. Toad followed him up the beach, but stopped where the smooth sand gave way to the rough expanse between the beach and the base of the tower. The prince felt the tingling in his waking feet give way to sharp, hot pain. He looked down to see a brilliant crimson liquid soaking the glassy sands. Squinting, he saw that beyond the shoreline was a field of sharp, glassy shards, crystalline razors that time and the waters had not broken down into the diamond sands of the beach. He carefully stepped back to the safety of the beach. The tower was so close, but his feet could not endure one more step of the final approach. He had no shoes, and was sure that the shards would tear through the toughest leather in a matter of steps anyway. The prince was heartbroken, for he recognized there was no other way to cross over. The midday sun burned, and he slumped against the side of the giant Toad for what little shade it could provide. But soon, even Toad shuffled back into the water to protect himself from the tyranny of sunlight. The prince strained his face in a constant hard squint, but could not bear the sight of the tower, which at this hour may as well have been a pillar of pure reflected sunlight. The hot sand cauterized the tiny cuts on his feet, but was unbearable to stand on. He too retreated into the salty water as a last refuge against the sun. The prince pondered the hopeless absurdity of his situation. He'd gone where he was going, and could go no further, nor could he go anywhere else. He thought of all the stories he'd heard of great heroes completing their quests, and of all the happily ever afters. They were all jokes of the darkest kind, played on those foolish enough to follow their heart. He'd given everything to ascend the tower steps, only to find his journey's end on a thin band of diamond shoreline, separating the world he'd left from the world before him. The prince appraised himself and his choices to be now here, which is to say, to be nowhere. He'd been warned against this journey by everyone, even by the wizard, who told him the ancient things are well protected against mortals. He had taken up on the adventure of a lifetime. He was no victim, and even though his journey was utter foolishness, his sun-bleached bones would lie on this beach to wish the next intrepid adventurer a better fate than his own. The prince eulogized himself, writing these words in the glittering sand. Here lies the Prince of Nowhere, whose story will never be told. The sun set behind the mountains, and the prince made his peace, burying his dead hope beneath a cross he traced in the sand below his epitaph. He decided that night he would make a feast of the magical bread and the wine. He would even offer some to Toad, though he doubted the giant frog would be interested. Toad preferred snapping insects from the air, of which there seemed precious few, if any, in this place. The only life on these shores was the two of them, and they weren't long for this world between worlds. Chapter 27. Twilight Before the Gates. At twilight, the prince unfolded the handkerchief with the rusk inside, placing the bread and the bottle of wine before him on the rapidly cooling sand. He rummaged through his bags for some tool to open the bottle. No luck. Then he searched his pockets and found his looking glass. Feeling curious, he put the arcane device to his eye and glassed the tower. He spied the familiar white monolith. The tower stretched into the heights and beyond view. He spotted the garden where he'd seen the sisters, but it was shut and no creature stirred. The men working the fallen stones in front of the tower were nowhere to be seen. An eerie stillness lay before the tower. Its long shadow extended in front of the gate. The prince noticed the bejeweled gates at the base of the tower had opened a crack. Absolute blackness of the kind that soaks up light like a sponge spilled from the doors. A shadow, not cast by light, began to roll out like a carpet to the base of the 11 crystal pillars. As the shadow touched the crystal, they grew smoky, and a licorice green flame was lit inside each of them in the shape of an archway. The prince recognized that cold fire all too well. From each of the flaming archways came a handful of women and men cloaked in dark crimson robes. They were very careful to keep their feet on the expanding shadow that grew before the tower gates. They each held a candle tinged with green flame and were chanting something in unison, though the prince could not understand their dark song. He watched as they filled in through the portals, 12, 22, 33 of them. The prince soon lost count. At the front of the procession were 6 priests of the realm who knelt before the now open gate while the rest bowed their heads. The prince heard inside his mind the sound of monstrous breathing. The breath warped the air in front of the tower, distorting reality in waves, and extinguishing the candles which, by some magic, lit themselves again moments later. Pinpricks of colorful light pulsed in the galactic darkness beyond the gate. "Rise," commanded the slow, cold voice of whatever hulking monster lay beyond the doors. The prince felt ice creep into his spine at the sound. The priests got to their feet, and the rest of the Red Robe pilgrims stood at attention. A young boy near the back stumbled, but was yanked to his feet by a woman standing near him. Falling bricks from high upon the tower wall pounded the ground on either side of the gate. The prince watched as the head of a massive bejeweled dragon dipped low and emerged from the gate and the diamond dust of the fallen stones. The rest of its enormous body followed, encrusted in treasures of all kinds, jewels of many shapes, size, and color, silver and gold coins, royal chalices, and platinum chains. From crown to tail, every precious thing known to man was grafted onto its flesh like armor. Its eyes were set with the crown jewels, a giant sapphire for its right eye and a large ruby for the left. Light flashed from them in hypnotic patterns to glamour the crowd. The robed ones fell before the beast. The dragon stretched its mighty wings, standing tall and revealing 6 more heads, 3 on each side, each one with the royal horn used for high feasts grafted onto the crown of its head. The grinning teeth of the dragon were sheathed with the curved daggers the priest used for ritual sacrifice. Inside the black maw of its 7 mouths slithered forked tongues gilded with the scaly armor of the Imperial Guard. The prince shuddered to think what became of the elite soldiers who decorated the tongues of this hydra. "What gifts dare you bring me in dread hope of the gifts I may give to you?" the glamour dragon bellowed. The visitors stood, then shuffled nervously into line before the beast. The eyes of the dragon never stopped flashing. The prince lowered his view to avoid the dragon's glamour. A young man stepped forward, saying, "I have a great tale to tell, and would offer it to you, Lord of the Precious Gate, if only for a pittance of your great fame and the smallest jewel from your crown to remember you by." The dragon grinned at the man and bellowed, "Tell your tale, and I will decide if it pleases me." The man told his tale, and lo, it was wonderful to the prince's ears, exciting his mind and warming his heart. However, when the man finished, the dragon dropped his giant head and looked at him with fierce jealousy and greed, for the dragon could not tell a tale so wonderful as that. The storyteller stepped back in trepidation, but those behind shoved him forward, and the mouth of the dragon scooped him up, extinguishing his screams in one bite. Blood ran down the dragon's jowls, and when it opened its mouth, its silver tongue glistened bright, wet crimson. He hissed and spoke to the young man next in line. "And what would you offer me?" The man replied, "I wish nothing more than to be famous and have my name revered across the land." The dragon's nostrils puffed with steam. "You are a depraved fool. I asked what you offer me, and you bring me nothing more than your naked ambition. I should have you cut to pieces and fed to the rats of the city, for even they are more noble than you. Yet, so that the people may know that I am merciful, I will grant you your passion. You will tell the tale of the previous bard, and the people will hang on your every word. You will be famous throughout the ringed city, but hear me carefully, for this is how you will tell the story." The prince winced at the poison of the words that followed. The dragon spoke. He plugged his ears, but the sound was in his head. It was a mockery of the original story, full of guile and riddled with every foul vice. Only a dull fascination remained, enough to hold one's attention, but the beauty was twisted into an unwholesome end. "Come, my child, and receive your reward." The man bowed and leapt forward to receive his prize. The dragon shook its breasts, and a dusting of jewels and coins fell to the ground, and the man fell to gather them. The rest of the dark pilgrims fell in line to make their offering, their greed outweighing their fear. The prince watched as one young woman sang a song. The dragon extended his forked tongue to the crown of her head, and the beautiful innocence of her melody was changed into low tones of brazen seduction that ranged to the heights of wild ecstasy. Those who offered words of wisdom before the dragon were reduced to babbling fools, and were paid handsomely, with priestly and political posts throughout the city. Criminals who offered stolen treasures to the dragon were rewarded with clever schemes to increase their plunder. Violent murderers who fancied themselves great warriors showed their strength by slaying their neighbor on the spot and offering the dragon their victims, which it snapped up in its great maw. To these were given deadly weapons and whispered knowledge of cruelties and murderous plots beyond any human imagination. Whatever anyone offered to the dragon was rewarded in one of three ways. 1. Being eaten alive. 2. Their gift becoming a rank inversion of itself. Or 3. Greater evil being added to the evil they had to offer. The last of the red-robed cult members to make an offering was the lady who'd helped the young man who'd stumbled. She tugged at him, trying to draw him to the dragon, but he pulled away, and as he did, his hood fell, and the prince was shocked to recognize the youth. The boy was the idiot child of a high noble, a simple one, without the graces or intellect befitting the royal house. He was small in stature and looked like a child, for he was slow to grow. The prince remembered how he and the other children used to mock the boy, and the prince fell to his knees and wept tears of shame at the sight of him. He prayed fervently to God to forgive him his cruelty and for the boy to be delivered from the terrors of the glamour dragon. His prayerful tears blurred his vision, sparing him the sight of what happened next. Chapter 28. The Red Robe. The priests surrounded the woman and grabbed the boy. She disrobed and began to dance before the great dragon. Her crude gestures and frenetic gyrations pleased the dragon, and it roared in ecstatic approval, evoking irresistible passions in those remaining. The strong men stripped naked and flew to the dancing queen, and grabbed her flesh and defiled her viciously, while the rest defiled each other in blinding ecstasy. The priests did not enter the orgy. They spoke incantations to strengthen the frenzy, chanting as one in the voice of the dragon. Arise, queen of the dragon. Arise, priestess of the night. Naked and shameless before the moon. Arise now and take what's yours by right. The dancing queen shook off the strong men, now bloodied by deep gouges in their flesh from her sharp fingernails and vicious bites. 2 of the priests came to the queen, bowed, then dressed her in crimson robes of fine royal silk. Robes of this kind were the customary dress of virgin brides on their wedding day. The bright red robe was worn over a dress of pure white, over undergarments of laced gold. A virgin bride would shed the robe as she climbed the steps of the altar to meet her groom. The queen of the dragon was an abomination, and this ritual an unholy affair. Barely covered, her nakedness and filth remained on display. She stepped forward, taking the boy from the priest with her talons, his face flushed with terror and tears. She pulled the boy tight to her sweaty bosom and stroked his hair like a mother would. The priests wrapped the luxurious robe around the boy. Then, in unison, 6 priests sunk their blades 6 times into the silken cocoon as the 6 heads of the Hydra and its greater 7th howled with delight. The woman shrieked in agony and ecstasy as the tips of the blades went through the boy and pricked her own belly. She and the boy held each other tight in an embrace lasting until the life was drained from his body and she could no longer hold her grip on his dead weight against the slippery mess of blood, sweat, and seed of man covering her body from the ritual. The woman opened her robe, and the remains of the boy dropped to the ground. All watched the Crimson Queen in silent awe and knelt in terror. The silence raised the prince from his grief. He looked up just in time to see the dragon raise its mighty heads and ignite the remains of the boy in a spit of green flame from its terrible mouths. The body became a bonfire, and the woman, now fully possessed, stood before the fire with arms stretched to the sky as the dragon spoke through her mouth. Behold my undying fire. It will burn for as long as you offer me your gifts, your talents, and your lives. Now, my children, in this final hour, come to me as I offer you the greatest gift. Come and partake of my very own flesh and blood. The priests gathered beneath each of the 6 lesser heads of the dragon, now dipped low to the ground in mock humility. The prince watched as the priests raised their curved blades, then slashed down, severing the dragon's heads. The 7th and greatest head roared to the heavens as blood spewed from the slender necks of the decapitated hydra, now writhing like wild tentacles. The priests held the heads high for all to see, then tossed them on the fire, which erupted in wintergreen flame. The naked revelers were sent into a great frenzy and did unspeakable acts of fornication with the dragon until they were utterly spent and could no longer look one another in the eye. The prince looked away from the gruesome sight in horror and in great tears of shame. His hair and beard had turned white. Some of these dark pilgrims were from his own household. Some were the bards whose story he loved and whose songs he sang. The priests who brutally murdered the village idiot also presided over feasts and holy days in the city. The Red Queen was the noble mother of the child. They had all come by some black magic to the tower to seek power from the great glamour dragon. And they would all return with their reward to a city that would marvel at their newfound riches and abilities. A city none the wiser to the unspeakable horror of the ritual sustaining its power and wealth. The prince sobbed with bitter grief, stripped of all illusion about the nature of the world he thought he'd left behind. Now come full circle here at the base of the tower. He was no different than any of them. Their blood was his blood. He'd drunk their wine on many occasions. He carried a bottle of it even now. In a dark corner of the soul, in a flash of vision, he saw and felt himself in the place of the boy. He was the fool tucked in the robe, face pressed against the sweet dirt and musky sweat of the Red Queen's bosom. He felt a brief comfort in her embrace. Then his heart was pierced by 7 knives, and the vision faded. The crescendo of the night's revelry sounded like pink noise in his mind. Noise bypassing his hearing and giving him vertigo. Noise that by the glamour of the dragon he could not silence. The exhausted prince fell to his hands and knees and retched violently. He kept his gaze low, watching the full moonlight gleam off the sand through bleary eyes. Toad licked away his tears, and the prince looked up to see a ridiculous grin on Toad's face. Then, a flash of light from the glamour dragon was reflected in those giant eyes, and the prince turned to see the last of the revelers, heads held low, disappearing again into the portals of the 11 pillars. The dragon was alone before the gate, with each of its 6 heads grown back with human faces, bearing a familiarity with the revelers who'd fornicated with it. The full moon shone upon the world before the tower in the dark of night, and the dragon stared with irresistible force straight at the prince, eyes pulsing. He locked his gaze on the prince, and the prince found he could not turn away. The glamour dragon spoke into his thoughts. "You've come to the tower by a long and hard way, young prince, and now you are here, but cannot venture any further to your great desire. Truly you are a prince of nowhere." "I'm not yours, you scourge," the prince shot back. You speak true, you are not mine. Allow me to be yours then, in the moments I have remaining tonight, and to bear you across the glassy fields, razor sharp to your weak flesh. I will bring you to the tower. I will bear you on my diamond wings to its keep this very night." The prince was silent of mind. The dragon spoke again. "You are a noble prince of the royal house of the king, a good man, unlike those filthy sycophants who visited me tonight. It would be my great honor to bring you to your journey's end. I require nothing more than the slightest gesture. A simple bow will do. A token of respect from such a mighty lord as yourself is all I ask." The prince stood tall before the dragon, while whispering a simple prayer he'd learned from the angels in the vineyard. Behind the dragon, the creatures of the garden began to stir. The moon was now very bright, and the shadow before the tower began to dissolve, and the dragon took a step back into the gate and spoke. "You must choose me now, or you will die on that beachhead. Let me help you. I will give you all you've come so far, now only to lose. Together we will ascend to the heights of the tower and reveal its mysteries, you and I together like gods. You are very near your end, Prince. You must see this," said the dragon, barely concealing the mocking tone of those last words. The dragon grew impatient and angry at the prince's silence, and began to curse him under his gilded, forked tongue. The dragon was agitated as some force made it take a few steps back into the darkness behind the gate. "I don't have long, my prince. A word of acknowledgement from you, and I will snatch you to your destiny." The prince stood in confident defiance as the dragon retreated. The beast shrieked a curse at the prince, and he could taste the foul air of its carnal breath even from such a distance. "My time is short, but yours is at an end. I will make you the greatest in all the realms, a king atop the watchtower between worlds. Simply honor me, and I will give you more than all you can ask or imagine." After no response from the prince, the dragon spoke one final time. "Fool, if you will not bow to me, then I will show you all that you've lost in your meaningless quest before I burn you into oblivion." The prince watched as an emerald fire kindled in its great mouth, then spewed forth flames that barreled across the ground straight towards the prince and his toad. The prince braced himself, tightened his jaw, narrowed his gaze, and steadied his prayer. He hung his chest high on lifted shoulders and faced the glamour dragon as the flames engulfed him in white-green blaze. The dragon shrieked in rage, but the sound was all around him and in him, but the prince felt the flame as a cool breeze and suffered no harm. In those death-dealing flames, he saw great visions of paradise, angels guarding him, and beings too strange and wonderful for him to understand. He was caught up, climbing his way to the higher realms. When he looked below to see how far he'd ascended, he saw that Toad was now a strong man, a royal guard, kneeling and looking up at the prince in stoic appreciation. His reverie was too much to take in, and the prince felt a new threat, the annihilation of joy. The flame was extinguished, and he turned to see the dragon mercilessly driven behind the gate by the spear of an angel whom he recognized at once. It was the Lady of the Water, whom he'd met in his vision, in his dream the first night by the lake. He watched her cast the dragon back where it came from and shut the gates. Chapter 29. A Path to the Tower. He turned to find the toad was indeed now a guard of the royal house, and the prince rushed to help his companion to his feet. The prince asked the guard why he'd helped him, and a dozen other things. The guard smiled, pointing at the tower, and said, "Look, my prince, the way to the tower is made before you. There's no time to waste. As for my purpose in all of this, we can speak of it another time. It is enough to say that I'm a guard of your father, the king, and sworn to protect you. And today you've seen to it that my curse is ended and my form restored. Honor me by completing your journey." The prince replied, "Will you escort me to the base of the tower? I ask not as your prince, but as your friend." The guard nodded in agreement, and together they turned to see the stars and moon perfectly reflected in a mirror of smooth glass. The dragon fire had melted the sand and crystal shards into a narrow path leading straight to the tower. At the end of the road, the Lady of the Lake stood before the glittering gate, beckoning the prince to draw near. The prince could see her daughters at play in the glowing gardens, and the men were returning to the great playa to shape the stones which had fallen from the tower. It was just as he'd seen in his dream. The moon was low and fat in the sky, and its golden light led his every step to the great base of the tower. The prince bowed deeply before the Lady of the Lake and kissed the glassy ground beneath her feet, all the while asking himself, "What's her name?" "Rise, prince, you are greatly favored to arrive at the gates of the great white tower." The prince rose and spoke. "My lady, what of the dragon? For if the beast is not defeated, I fear its return." "Listen, I tell you a secret. The dragon remains for a time, and must remain until the cup of its judgment is full to overflowing. On that day the dragon will be dragged from its dungeon by iron hooks in its nose and brought into daylight before the tower, and all the riches armoring it will bake the dragon in the heat of the sun until its insides boil and its flesh shrivels to dust, and its memory is forgotten. All those who sacrifice themselves to gain the dragon's power only serve to hasten the hour of its destruction. Do not fear. It is not free to roam outside the shadow of the tower, and only until midnight of a full moon. It rages because it knows its time is short, and hates all who refuse its glamour. The dragon only has power over those who offer it their power. You did not bend your knee, seventh son of the king, and you were not burned by the dragon's flame. Indeed, I know that you saw many higher things in those flames. Behold, the tower is before you, and your reward awaits. Will you pass through one of its many gates? To ascend its heights, you must remember my name. Forget me, and your journey will be in vain. Hear my words, dear prince. I give wisdom for a guide. Be careful not to slip on the dragon's first lie, for the higher you ascend and the nearer your end, the more you'll be tempted by pride. Now the way ahead is a spire in heights. Do you believe it will end at the keep with the lights? The door is shut to those who see with their eyes, opening only to those who are faithfully blind. So far you've come for what you hold dear, a prince of nowhere, and now you are here. You've only begun, but you think you are near. You've only begun, no matter the tear. The Lady of the Lake finished speaking and dissolved into glittering petals of moonflower and starlight that rode the breeze into the garden where her daughters played. The prince turned to his friend the guard and said, "My friend, I have need of your service one last time." The guard bowed to the prince in silent acceptance. The prince reached into his secret pocket, drew his looking glass, and handed it to the guard. "I task you with returning this looking glass to the city of our birth. A day will come when you will meet a child with the light of the stars in their eyes, and you will give them this glass as a gift. Go now, return to the service of my father the king, but speak nothing of this journey to anyone." The guard replied, "It has been the great honor of my life to bear you forth on this quest," said the soldier. "I will watch for this child and fulfill my charge. Go now." The prince spoke in the language of the stars, and a portal of golden light opened in the sixth crystal pillar, and the guard returned to the city. Chapter 30. The Prince Before the Gates. The moon dipped behind a small cloud. The crystals dimmed, and the prince was alone, standing before 3 gates, which led to the spiral stairs of the tower. He was uncertain which to take. The bejeweled gate the glamour dragon came through remained open a crack. The prince heard the dragon whispering proud words behind the door, boasting how its voice carried on the wind to the edge of the world. Over the door mantle was light-scribed in star runes the name King's Gate. Upon its doors were the names of every person who'd entered the tower by this way. It was an impressive list of the great luminaries of history, both remembered and long forgotten. As decorated as these doors were, there was plenty of room for more, even for his own name, should he choose the way of kings. The prince heard a voice from the cracked door saying, "This door is fit for a king. This door is yours by right as a prince of the realm. I'm locked away in the deepest dungeon and cannot harm you. You have no need to climb to the keep. Enter here and you will be immediately transported to the heights." The prince considered the words. It was true that he had the right to enter by this door, and he didn't think the dragon could threaten him. And a portal to the keep would bring a swift end to this long journey. The voice beyond the king's gate continued to reason with him. But the prince remembered her words, "I give you wisdom for a guide." He heard a small voice on the breeze say, "You did not arrive at the tower in the way of the king. Will you now ascend as one?" The prince considered this, frowned, then walked to the left towards the gate which led to the gardens. An ornate archway wrought in bands of pure silver and decorative shapes of delicate fruits and flowers invited him into paradise. The gate was wide open, walled on each side by thick hedges, blooming with neon flowers. Supple vines wound themselves up and around the delicate silver, and by some magic spelled the words "beautiful" in the language of the stars over the archway. Iridescent moss grew between the ancient stone pavers of its pathway. He heard the song of the Moon Mother's daughters, sweetly singing. Peeking in, but careful not to enter, the prince saw many wonderful and curious creatures peeking back at him, before darting deeper into the trees of the garden. The fragrance of this Eden was heady. With every breath, his desire grew to rush in and follow the path to the heart of the garden's delights. There was a voice rattling in the leaves, barely heard above the beautiful singing. "Has the fragrance of my garden already quenched your desire for the tower? If you've forgotten your first love before the beautiful gate, how will you remember your way once you are within them?" The prince was sad, for having seen it, he wanted little more than to enter through the beautiful gate. He gathered himself, taking one slow and big breath before venturing to the gate on the right. It was a small iron gate built into a rock wall with a low stone archway, tall enough for a small pack animal. There was an inscription over the gate in a language the prince could not read. The gate was rusted shut and heavily guarded by withered, prickly vines. A recollection of the hag of the blood vines flashed in his mind, and he winced. There was no way to enter by this gate. There was no voice to guide him, only deep silence in the darkening night as the moon dipped behind the mountains. In that silence, he tried to remember her name, even though she'd never spoken it. The prince sat before the gate, considering this silence. In his youth, he thought silence was a punishment, a dread emptiness to be filled with a joyful noise. But his time tending the blood vines had taught him the sweet fullness of silence. Angels taught him to pray in silence, and through practice he learned the unfathomable wisdom of silence. "The wisdom of silence," spoke the prince. "Wisdom." Breaking the silence again, he spoke her name. "Sophia." He heard the gate click. The prince got to his feet and pulled the small rusty door open with ease, breaking the brittle vines into dust. He stooped below the short archway and entered the overgrown darkness beyond. The prince found himself before a tall white block, the first of the spiral steps wrapping the tower. These steps were made for giants, thought the prince, as he jumped to grab the edge and pull himself up the ancient stone. Chapter 31. The Spiral Staircase. The prince draped his saddlebags over his shoulders and continued to climb. The progress was slow and awkward, each giant step a grueling achievement. Even from such a low level, the view from the tower was spectacular. He could see the wonders of the glowing gardens extending like a river of lights deep into the mountains. He read the stars high above, their twinkling lights encouraging him upward, each step a little easier to climb than the last. After what seemed an endless night of climbing and communing with the stars, dawn broke, splaying its light across the ocean. The prince, wonderstruck, saw that he was very high now. The ground below was a grainy blur in the golden dawn. He gazed above, hoping to see the walls of the keep, but there was only the underside of more steps to climb. He sat facing the sun, pulled a few rations from his bag, and ate his breakfast before climbing further up the tower. The higher he climbed, the further he could see. Stopping for lunch, he saw in the distance the glassmaker's island. A pinprick of white light flashed from the oculus of the observatory, and he waved to the wizard as the morning sun warmed his face. The prince, tired from climbing, closed his eyes to rest. Then, awakened by the sound of grinding rock, the prince turned to see an ill-fitted gray stone in the wall of the tower. The block had a large scowling face etched deep into its edifice. The face spoke. "You know they say the wizard is a coward. He's too afraid to leave the island. But look at you. You're not afraid. You had the courage to follow your heart, and now you're here, high above many worlds. You've seen more today than the glassmaker will see in his lifetime. I pity him, don't you?" The prince could not deny that he felt a kind of pity for the wizard, but said nothing to the face in the block in the wall. "Well, if not pity for the poor fool, how about scorn for his pathetic attempts to distract you from your journey? Yeah, I watched him do it, from right here, and if my mouth were not as dry as dust, I would spit at him from these heights. Go on, spit at him in your disgust." It was true. The prince had felt angry at the wizard for distracting him from his journey, but he said nothing to the face in the block in the wall. No matter then. I see that you're above these petty grievances. You must be a very good man. Look out to the city. Do you see how much better you are than all of them down there? You know how wicked they are in that city, how little love they share, selling their children for the wine of that witch. Can you imagine? Not to mention what disgusting acts they performed with that evil dragon. You're their prince. You know that you have every right to reproach them. There's nothing wrong with keeping in your heart the knowledge of how much better you are than those deplorables. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know is the truth, and I can see that you prize truth above all things." The prince was shocked and dismayed by the thought of those who'd done such horrible things with the dragon. And he spoke to the face in the block in the wall, saying, "You see far from these heights, even perceiving my own thoughts. Tell me, how did you become stuck in the tower wall?" The face in the brick in the wall replied, "This tower is a collection of living stones. We were all like you once. You cannot climb forever. Just wait. You'll reach a height that suits you, and you'll take rest in the cool of an empty space in the tower wall, and you'll become a brick to hold the weight of the tower just like the rest of us." The prince asked, "Tell me, why are you so much darker than the other bricks?" The brick furrowed its brow, and with great pomposity said, "I'm not like these other stones. I'm dark that you might notice me. These other stones you see shimmering with etheric light, don't become like them. They possess no will of their own. They are entirely given to the work of holding up the tower. I, however, look down upon the world, and I have taken it upon myself to wait here for fellow travelers like you to show you the truth about yourself and the world below." The prince replied, "You are right to say that I prize the truth. And the truth is that I awoke to the sound of you sliding towards the precipice. You are about to fall. and you would have me fall with you by the pride of my own heart. My pity for the wizard is only that he cannot share this moment with me together. My disappointment in the failings of others is a mirror into my own soul, and I choose to forgive. You may be right that there is truth in reproach, but there is no love. Tell me then, what is truth without love? At this question, the face in the brick in the wall grimaced, then gave a short grunt and fell from the tower. The prince watched as the massive block tumbled in the air and smashed into the ground below. The prince kept climbing, and after many days and many meals, his saddlebags grew smaller and his burden lighter. He could easily pull himself up the stairs now without jumping. Nevertheless, his suffering increased with every step. At these heights, the naked rays of the sun baked him alive, while his feet blistered on the white-hot stone. Relief came only from the shadow side of the tower, where a chill breeze whisked the sweat from his damp clothes. His comfort, however, was short-lived, as this caused him to shiver and wish again for the sunny side of the tower. There were many open spaces in the walls at this altitude, and the prince often considered resting in one of them. It would be so easy to stop climbing, to rest, to become one of the bricks in the tower wall. His mind whipped up fantasies of what it would be like to become one with the tower, and these fantasies found many rational allies, making the case for why it would be best to rest. Yet the prince felt compelled in his heart to enter the tower's keep, and he kept climbing. The tower had a weirding effect on the measure of time. He had no idea how long it had been since he started climbing the first giant step, and he could no longer keep track of the days. Instead, he measured his progress by how far he saw. No matter how high he climbed, the mountain ranges at the base of the tower kept extending in ever higher peaks out to the horizon. Squinting hard, he could see the lake he and Toad crossed. It looked the size of one of the small diamonds embroidered onto his royal coat. The lake was surrounded by forests and the marshes bordering the blood vines. Beyond them, the land was painted with many golden meadows. He looked out to the ringed city. The city looked small and dull from these heights, smoke rising from her in wisps, smearing the watery skies above, its pale walls blending into the plains that stretched to the edge of the world. The prince kept climbing, his calloused feet bounding up the steps with ease. He made steady progress now, while often pausing to take in the ever-expanding view of the overlapping worlds on the horizon. They were perfectly ordered, some above, some below, each one ringed in the orbiting lights of dusk and dawn, racing around to make up a day. The prince could only tell the difference between day and night by the way the angels looked more like stars for a time, and by the light of the moon, for there was always a full moon somewhere. He climbed these heights in perpetual twilight. While this eased the hot and cold cycle of days gone by, the prince was afflicted with mild vertigo that caused him to lose his sense of balance and nearly tumble over the edge more than once. On one occasion, the prince was looking straight down into the formless void far below the base of the tower. Visions of colorful fire bursting forth from a swirl of mesmerizing smoke tempted him with a perverse sensation of wanting to fall. Feeling woozy, he vomited his meager lunch into the void, nearly losing his balance and falling from the tower steps. From then on, he avoided looking into the abyss altogether. On another occasion, looking up, through a larger-than-normal gap in the steps above him, he saw into the heart of the sun, no longer a tyranny of white-hot light, but rather a kaleidoscopic portal, a synesthetic symphony of colors the likes of which the prince had never seen or dreamed. There were no stars in the sky now, only the flight of angels. A chorus of angels circled the rim of the sun, their song holding the circumference in a perfect circle. Straining his eyes, he could see many higher orders of angels appear and disappear into the wash of primordial light at the center of the center of the center of the sun. The prince closed his eyes, but continued to see. It was all too much order and light to look at directly. He bowed his head and from then on avoided looking into the highest heights altogether. Keeping his head down, he continued to climb. His understanding of the light grew from the warmth, the sound, and the knowledge of each ray. And to his great delight, his skin began to glow in harmony with the radiance of the sun. Finally, the time came when, looking up, he saw the outcropping of the keep in the gap between the steps. A rush of excitement broke over him, and the prince climbed the remaining stairs with great ease, as if the steps were made for children. But the sight of the remaining gaps in the wall, where the unfit stones had fallen, sobered him, and he steadied his approach to the keep. Gratitude overwhelmed him as he reached the landing before the small wooden door of the keep. Candlelight flickered in the window of the keep, but he could not peer inside without falling. The only way forward was to enter. The prince straightened his trusty clothing, still as regal as the day he left the city. He rummaged through his saddlebags, which had noticeably shrunk over the course of his climb, and took in hand the wine and bread he'd carried all this way. The bottle was much smaller than he remembered, and the rusk the size of a crumb. It was at this moment he realized the steps had not grown smaller as he climbed. He had grown larger. Astounded by his transformation, he joked to himself that he'd better enter the keep before he grows too large to fit inside. The small blackened door had no handle to pull, so the prince pushed the door with his giant hand. It didn't budge. He stared at the door in silence, and in the wisdom of silence, he closed his eyes, saying, "The door is shut to those who see with their eyes." He opened his heart, praying, opening only to those who are faithfully blind. He knocked on the door, singing, "So far you've come for what you hold dear, a prince of nowhere, and now you are here." The door clicked, then opened. Stooping, the Prince of Nowhere entered the keep. And if you listen close, you can still hear his song carried on the breeze. You've only begun, and yet you are near. You've only begun, no matter the tear. This ends The Prince of Nowhere. Postscript. A young maiden sat against the greasy walls of the city, peering through a beautifully crafted looking glass with arcane runes embossed on its tarnished shaft. It was the summer solstice, and a low fat moon was ascending on the horizon. This was the night of the royal gala, and everyone was trying to get to the center of the city for the party. The maiden, however, was uninterested with the pomp and ceremony of the royals. Instead, she was glassing her favorite sight in all the realm, the great white tower, when she saw a sudden flash of light from its keep. Her heart raced. She'd never before seen such a dramatic display from the tower. Zooming in, she watched as a host of stars descended like angels to fit a radiant new stone in a gap high upon the tower wall. The tower shimmered with the new addition. Awestruck, she felt the sonnets of joy in her bones. And from that day forward, the young maiden set her heart on pilgrimage to the tower. Epilogue. The Death of the Witch. After many months, the king grew impatient for the delay in wine delivery. He sent a cohort of royal knights to the vineyard. Upon arrival, they found the few remaining dwarves gaunt, bleary-eyed, and delusional. When they inspected the estate, the door would not budge, and so with great axes they broke it down. The sigil above the door dropped to the ground unnoticed and was trampled upon entrance. The floor was covered in thick white ash and kicked up a cloud of fine dust, giving the place an ethereal glow. They found the hag sitting in her chair by the great fireplace, feeble and unmoving. One of the knights caught a flash of her green eyes, and in his horror cleaved her head with his axe. The knights slew the remaining dwarves and toads, unaware that these were their war horses and kin, transformed by the hag in the mirror pools of the marshes. They loaded their carts with the remaining wine from the storehouses and carried the loot back to the city.
Thank you for listening to this audio recording of The Prince of Nowhere, read by the author. Copyright 2024. A Tigler production.
Visit tigler.com.
The way ahead, inspiring heights. Will it end at the keep with the lights? The door is shut to those who see, with their eyes open only to the faithfully blind. So far you've come for what you hold dear, a prince of nowhere, and now you are here. You've only begun, you think are near. You've only begun, no matter the tears. No matter your tears.